review the exceptions as part of the examination roles for a local client. First of all, can everybody hear me okay? I am slightly losing my voice. We don't have any microphones in the room. So the microphones that pick up the live stream are very sensitive. We don't have microphones on the table, so no one speak clearly. But if at any stage anybody can't hear me, especially back, please do let me know. You can send an email on phones and other electronic devices are turned off or on silent, just so don't disrupt proceedings as we go along. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Matthew Shaw, Chartered Town Planner and the Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to hold the examination. This is stage 2 of the examination. For those of you who present 6 to 8 weeks ago, we discussed some legal compliance matters. And following those hearings, I wrote to the council. And I wrote to the council to say that I was satisfied that the examination could proceed to stage 2. Now, the eagle eye amongst you have asked the question, well, does that mean that use of operator has been passed, everything's moved on? I didn't set out any conclusions in that letter. That letter purely said that I was satisfied that the examination could proceed to this stage. No conclusions were set out in that letter or drawn from it. A few housekeeping matters to run through first. The programme officer, Charlotte Clancy, no doubt you will be in touch with Charlotte with regard to attending today's session. Charlotte can't be with us this week, so Hannah at the back of the room is standing in, so I'll just ask Hannah just very briefly say hello and introduce herself.
I'm the programme officer in case of Charlotte, and I'll be able to email if anyone needs to contact me on the room down there as well. And I'm going to read out the fire drill as well procedure, if that's okay. In the event of fire alarm ringing continuously, you must immediately evacuate the building at all case. The officers will escort you from that direct available route. No one is to use the lift at all. We will make our way to the fire assembly point by the entrance to the town hall yard car park on one side. Once outside, a check will be made to ensure everyone is safely left and no one is to re-enter the building until advised that it's safe to do so. On Fridays at 2 PM, the fire alarm will ring briefly to test the system. It's not a fire drill unless it continues to ring continuously. And that's it. And as has been mentioned, the microphone is very sensitive today, so don't whisper or anything like that, because everything will be picked up on the recording.
Okay, thank you. And just if I just ask some from council just to explain for those of you, I know it's quite busy over the corridor today as it was while I was explaining what's going on and where toilets and things are.
Thank you, sir. So this morning is annual council. It is the mayor making procedure. So some of you may see people in gowns, etc., walking down the corridors as you arrive today. That will take place. It starts at 10 o'clock. We'll run for a couple of hours, so there will be more people in the corridors today than usual. In terms of facilities, the gentlemen's facilities are across the way in the just along the corridor, and the ladies are further along, turn left towards the chamber and then left again into the loading room, which is on the left hand side as you Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hannah, just in terms of, you said any sort of problems to email you, is that the same email address that everybody's been?
All the same email, Bank Solutions.
So Bank Solutions email. Okay, yeah. So any queries regarding anything to do with today's session or sessions this week, feel free to email the Home Officer as usual, and if any action is required, then Hannah can put those emails up today. I just briefly mentioned as well, I think there was a problem with the printing of some nameplates. I think one side of the room looks like they've got nameplates and the other side of the room doesn't. that's not a problem. We can sort that out at a mid-morning break or something. But obviously for those of you who don't have a nameplate, and we'll go around the table in a minute and introduce ourselves. But if you see me pointing, I'm not being rude. It's just I perhaps don't know who you are. I'll quickly run through the sort of formats of today and what we're going to be discussing. Obviously, we're moving on to discuss, moving away from some of the legal compliance issues and moving on to discuss some of the soundness issues and the justifications for the plan. And we're going to be moving on to discuss this morning housing needs and housing requirements, and this afternoon. And what I would just say is that the purpose of the hearings is it's a roundtable discussion, and it's obviously it's led by myself. It's not like a public inquiry. There's no presentation, no witnesses will be called, etc. It really is an opportunity to put your points across as representatives and have a discussion and debate about some of the issues. What I would just say, more happy people to participate in the discussion. There's no set agenda for today, so we'll go through matters, issues and questions. There's probably quite a lot of me asking questions of the council and getting participants involved in that discussion. As I said, more than happy for people to participate, and that's what today's about. But please do stick to the points that you've made in your representations. The hearing is not an opportunity to sort of introduce new points or new evidence that people haven't had an opportunity to see or hear before. What I would just say as well, we'll take a break mid-morning. There's a reasonable amount to get through today. This session is scheduled to finish at 1 o'clock. We may go slightly over, but I think there'll be plenty of time this afternoon. So if we did run over, I think this afternoon's session is a bit shorter, so we should get through all the matters. And yet, as Hannah said, the microphones are sensitive. Obviously, during breaks, the live stream will stop, but if people could obviously chatting between themselves, etc. If they are sensitive, so we'll pick that up and interference. Please ask any discussion, unless you're speaking at the hearing, sort of kept to a minimum. Okay, so I've introduced myself, as has Hannah, the program officer this week. So as we've done on previous sessions, starting with the council, if I could just ask everyone to go around the table and introduce themselves. You can let me know, especially for those of you who have a name and like who you are. Whether you're acting on behalf of particular clients or residents group, and what your sort of key points or key interests in this session are, that would be much appreciated.
Good morning, sir. My name is Paul Shedder-Redding, QC, acting for the council.
Good morning. My name is David Marlowe. I'm a planning policy consultant retained by the Borough Council.
Good morning, sir. My name is Nick Ireland, and I'm a director of a consultancy called Iceni Projects, and I work with the council on the review of local housing.
Good morning, sir. My name is David Mayer, M-A-H-E-R. I'm from Barton Wilmore, here on behalf of Dandara regarding its site allocation interests at Strasbourg Farm Mutual.
I'm Jane Piper. I'm the director at Barton Wilmore, here on behalf of Cress Nicholson. She's the allocation at North West at Padwood.
Good morning, I'm Julie Davis from CPRE Kent, the Countryside Charity.
Good morning, David Murray Cox, Director at Turley on behalf of Bellway.
Good morning, Lisa Skinner from Phase 2 Planning, Director representing Roscommon Strategic Land. Main interest to do with Halls London, but the high level issues on settlements.
Good morning, Michael Lees. I'm an architect and I'm representing the Town Hall.
Good morning, I'm Mark Booker, representing the Royal Town Forum, and I lead the strategic planning working group.
Good morning, I'm Peter Afarinos. I'm a member of the Southwest Road Community Action Group, and I'm not specifically representing them.
Good morning, sir. I'm David Neame from Neame Sutton, here on behalf of Ryden.
Troy Hayes, Chartered Town Planner, Managing Director of Troy Planning and Design here on behalf of Paddock Wood Town Council.
Judith Ashton here representing Redrow and Persimmon, who have interest land at east of Paddock Wood.
Mark Barrett from the Home Builders Federation.
Good morning, sir. My name is Gregory Jones, Queen's Counsel, instructed by Provision on behalf of Cooper Estate Strategic Land.
Also, I'm Catherine Miles, Director at Provision, Town Planner, representing Cooper Estate Strategic Land.
Good morning, sir. My name is Douglas Bond from Wolf Bond Planning. I'm here on behalf of Castle Hill Developments Limited, who have interests on land north of Tunbridge Wells.
Good morning, sir. James Neal, representing Soap Cable.
Good morning, Ryan Johnston, representing Tailwinds B and their interests at Cranbrook. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Before we get going, any housekeeping matters or procedural issues? Any questions, queries from anybody?
So it was just in relation to your observations about the procedure in terms of moving to stage 2. And you mentioned that you didn't set out any conclusions in your letter indicating that we would proceed to stage 2. I just want to be absolutely clear. So it is the position that you haven't made any decision in respect of those matters, and that therefore things are still at large, so to speak, for the rest of this hearing.
Yes. So obviously, I think it's fair to say that I'm mindful of obviously the time and cost implications of local planning examinations. Hence why we can do things in stages where, in the context of this examination, there was lots of debate and discussion on duties. Now, as I said in that letter, I'm satisfied that this examination can continue. I think it's fair to say that if I wasn't, then hence why we had the stages and all of those things. But what I haven't done is said the council has met the duty to cooperate, because we've only had 3 sessions, and as this examination goes forward, we start these big strategic issues and we sort of work through them and start to unpick things as well. So, and if you recall as well, the neighbouring authority at the last minute decided not to attend that last session. So now having sort of set the stall out, said council has absolutely met and passed the duty to cooperate. I haven't made any conclusions on that, and they've set out either in my final report or in any post-hearing correspondence. But as I did say to the council at the first stage, that I would sort of put a marker down. I'd be happy for this examination to continue, mindful that if I wasn't and I had some serious concerns, then in the interest of obviously everybody's time and money, then I'm set to that stage.
I'm grateful for that indication. So you'll understand why we're asking, because there's obviously going to be an overlap as we proceed, and we didn't want to necessarily repeat everything if you'd already come to a further
I understand it, and I think there's even questions today where we've had the duty to cooperate session, but clearly there will be discussions, topics as we go forward, which feed into that whole narrative really around what the council's done in preparation of the plan. Hence why there's no definitive conclusion. But as in terms of council, as I did have serious concerns about that, obviously, so we probably wouldn't be doing this.
So if I could just trouble you on point of procedure as well at this stage, mainly because I don't know if I'll be here at the end when we look forward to the next sessions. But it would be helpful if we could just get a bit of clarification over the publication of position statements on the website. I understand that I'm not quite sure when they're supposed to be
published or go up in advance of the hearings, but I understand there's been a bit of delay in receiving not just the council's position statements, but also others. They're sort of going up in drips and drabs. And we were just wondering, the reason we're concerned is that we've obviously got the stage 2, part 2 in mid-June. We don't quite know when we're going to receive.
So these hearing statements from other parties?
And from the council.
And from the council.
I think we got the council's position statement a week ago. I'm not making any point now about that. But my state paper is particularly concerned because it's obviously got quite an involved, it's going to be very heavily involved in part 2 of stage 2. And we would just like an indication of when those position statements will go up, because as we understand, they've all been submitted, but we just don't know when we're going to receive the council's position statement.
I'll speak to the Programme Officer about that, because obviously, statements are submitted, they then into the process, given ID reference numbers, etc., converted into slide format and uploaded to the website. But obviously, that process should be fairly swift, so people have got enough time in advance of hearings. So I can speak to the Programme Officer outside the hearings to make sure that's been done. I know that there was a couple of hearing statements that were late. And reasons given for those, and I accepted those. But no, on the whole, obviously it should be, within reason, a few days following submission, it should be able to be made available. So yeah, I can also chat to the council through the Programme Officer about that and make sure that's
We do put them up on the website as soon as we've received them. There's been a little delay recently, I understand, which is beyond our control, but we hope now it's cured.
Yeah. Well, no, I'll take that away, and we can make sure that special class second stage of stage 2. Everyone knows what I mean. Then we're we've Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Neal's raised a point I was going to raise, so I won't raise it. Just have a second point, and it's a discrete point relating to an email we received, I think, by Mr. Ireland in respect of a query those instructing me had raised, and that was sent to us on Monday, and it says the figures set out for ECH housing, elderly care housing, need in the council's housing topic paper, CD 3.73, an examination matter 8 statement should be updated. So the housekeeping matter we're raising is, what does that mean? What is going to happen? When can we expect an updated figure? I don't know if you've seen that communication.
No. If it's a point of clarity between with the council regarding a figure, then speak to the council. If a statement's got an incorrect figure, is this where we're going with this?
I don't know. It's more than that. It's if we're going to get a new topic paper coming out the blue, we need to know: are we going to have a new topic paper, and if so, when?
Okay.
That's as blunt as that, really. So.
Okay. Sounds like a matter to ask the council.
Could I ask for you, sir? So that there must be, council must know.
I'll take some instructions from.
Yeah. I think that's probably a query to have outside of the discussion around the table. Clearly, if something needs updating, then if the council can let me know through the Programme Officer whether or not something will be.
I'll do it through this morning's break.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. Anything else before we get going? Okay. As I said before, we sort of move the examination forward. Really, we've started to talk about some of these issues. Today, we're going to be looking at housing needs and housing requirements this morning. And again, I said that we'll work through the matters, issues, and questions. I think really the first question that I asked was around the minimum number of new homes needed over the plan period, how they've been calculated, and whether or not they were accurate. And I think, unless anybody has any objections or representations at this point, I think in terms of the actual methodology used and how the council has come to the housing requirements in the plan, so we've come on to talk about caps, and unmet needs, etc. But in terms of the actual methodology used, I didn't see anything that suggested that the council's actual maths or the numbers or the calculations was actually incorrect there. So that was really the first question. Once again, we'll come on to the process in a bit more detail. So the second question I asked, obviously, national planning policy, national planning guidance sets out the way in which housing requirements, housing needs should be calculated. The second question I asked was, it does allow for an alternative approach to be used to the standard method. So I asked in question 2 whether or not there are any exceptional circumstances which justify an alternative approach. And this builds upon some of the representation that people have made on the table. So we've got representatives saying that the housing figure should be higher. We've got representatives saying that the housing figure should be lower. But just in terms of considering whether or not there are any exceptional circumstances, is this something that the council considered, or did you go straight to standard method and say that's what we produce and we should do? Therefore, we've done it. Because we've talked a lot through the first few days of the examination about the constraints of this and neighbouring authorities. So is that something that the council sort of ever considered and weighed into the
Exceptional circumstances were considered as part of the work done by Mr. Ireland and his colleagues and council officers. And the conclusion was that there were no exceptional circumstances that warranted a different approach. The exceptional circumstances test in that sense is a high bar. And I'll ask Mr. Ireland to explain why, having regard to the work he did, the conclusion we came to was a correct one.
Thank you, sir. I think the 2 key references for you are the review of housing needs, which is CD375, and then the housing topic paper, which also deals with this, particularly in paragraphs 218 to 233. What has been looked at is both whether there are issues with, I suppose, the inputs to the standard method in terms of the demographic projections that feed into those, the affordability calculation, and then also the sort of, I suppose, the wider sort of set of circumstances and issues identified in the planning practice guidance in paragraph 2A10. I think it's summarising that position, and I suppose it's set out particularly in the review of housing needs on page 2. In terms of the demographic projections, both the 2016 and 2018 demographic projections were considered, and those showed weaker population growth. But the analysis undertaken shows that that's linked to essentially natural change and higher deaths than projected in the 2014 projections. And those are factors that are common to a range of areas across the country, and indeed the national projections in those rounds of projections, and so are not factors which are unique to Tunbridge Wells. And we're mindful that the planning practice guidance also says that projections more recent than the 2014 set will not be considered to be appropriate in the standard method. There's a paragraph in the planning practice guidance that sets that out. We did then also look at the circumstances where it might be set out in paragraph 10, 2A10 in the planning practice guidance. There isn't a great strategy that's in place here. There are key infrastructure improvements which will increase housing delivery, and we've also looked at historical delivery rates and the local housing need figure 678 is substantially above historical delivery trends, 369 homes per year, or indeed the previous plan, the previous core strategy figure. So the conclusion of the analysis is it has looked in some detail at the range of inputs, the standard method, and wider considerations. But exceptional circumstances don't exist, in our view, to justify an alternative assessment.
And representations as well as suggested that obviously the standard method calculation in this case includes a cap. Obviously has the effect of reducing what the figure is, housing requirement figure. And there's representations that have suggested that essentially the council should look at what the actual need is and plan for that figure rather than its capped figure. So again, is that something that the council did in the preparation of the plan? Was the reason why the council sort of stuck to the capped figure rather than the full need figure, if you like?
Yes, sir. So section 7 within the report specifically deals with that question, and looking at questions around deliverability. The council has also looked at it through the SA process. But so the minimum housing need set out, as identified in your first question, is the capped standard method figure. That's what the minimum housing need is. That's also what's referred to in paragraph 61 of the framework. At a national level, including the cap, it meets the government's target for delivering 300,000 homes per year. The evidence in the plan making process has tested whether higher level housing provision should be provided for, and the conclusions drawn there I suppose in the way this is couched in the PPG, it's a consideration of essentially whether you plan for a higher level of housing now, or you address it through an early review, and that's what's set out in paragraph 2A7 within the planning practice guidance. It almost gives you an either-or scenario. Either you look at a higher housing need now, or you consider an early review, and that's the issue that's been considered as part of the plan making process. The council's view, put simply, is that there are greater benefits from getting a plan in place earlier than seeking to amend this process to look at higher housing needs. There are notable constraints within this borough. Essentially, 2/3 or so is covered by the Green Belt and an area of outstanding natural beauty, and the plan and the trajectory within it actually provide the potential to meet housing needs with some flexibility in the initial essentially through to the early 2030s.
Okay, so two questions which I want to explore, and I think I was mindful that sort of talking about planning practice guidance and perhaps difficult for people to understand. I think I'll just read out a summary of what the planning practice guidance says. It says the standard method, and that's the methodology that is set out and that the councils follow. The standard method may identify a minimum local housing need figure that is significantly higher than the number of homes currently being planned for. The cap is therefore applied to help ensure that the minimum local housing need figure calculated using the standard method is as deliverable as possible. I think that's the situation that Tunbridge Wells finds itself in. So the cap reduces the minimum number generated by a standard method, but does not reduce the need itself. Therefore, strategic policies adopted with a cap may require an early review and updating to ensure that any housing need above the cap level is planned for as soon as is reasonably possible. Where the minimum annual local housing need figure is subject to a cap, consideration can still be given to whether a higher level of need could realistically be delivered. This will help authorities or prevent authorities from having to undertake the review. So what it's saying is, you apply the cap. That's not the full picture. It's still, the need is higher. I think what PVG is saying there is local authorities can still consider planning to meet their full needs. But if not, does it suggest that there should be an early review?
So I'll come in on this. Just by way of background, of course, yes, the council did consider the uncapped need. It considered whether we should apply the standard method, and that was the reason why ICD projects were appointed to produce the report. And Mr. Ryan has been clear in terms of the market potential and the deliverability. Then there are clearly issues with the higher level of provision because of the geographic constraint that bears on that. I think we do accept, and the council accepts, that there is a high affordability ratio. There always has been, and it's changed recently, along with changes in a much wider area nationally, really. So it did look at the higher provision, and of course, as Mr. Arnold said, that will be looked at through the sustainability appraisal process. It also, I think, has fed into the the consideration of, bear in mind that there is a substantial, as you say, 40% affordability uplift in the standard method, and that whilst we recognise that won't meet the full need, obviously to an extent that's going to be the case because there wouldn't be a cap otherwise, but you're not quite meeting the full need, but we are looking to maximise, we have looked to maximise the potential within the borough in terms of sustainable development. As regards the specific question on the review, I think to an extent we are, depending on what happens, of course, with delivery, and we'll talk about that in terms of supply, but on the face of it, we could well get towards that uncapped figure if everything went according to plan. So at this stage, I don't think there is a need for review, but clearly the council does monitor this and other aspects of the local plan annually, and has the ability to institute that review if we saw the supply was dipping or wasn't progressing.
So this leads on to the second question, which links back to some of the DSA work that we did, and we talked about, representatives have sort of criticised exactly that answer really, and have said, well, if because of this buffer that's worked into the plan, you would get to the uncapped, or nearly get to the uncapped figure. Why did the council discount that as an option? Because you tested it through the SA and you said that uncapped figure would be harmful, have landscape, air quality impacts, all the rest of it. So no, that's harmful. We considered that, and we put that to one side, and we're going to concentrate with the C7. Then equally, when we touched upon this on the SA day, is and as you just said then, well, actually, we're going to get to that figure anyway. So the question that representatives are probably asking, well, why not just plan positively to meet it? You're going to get there anyway. Why not just plan to meet that?
I'll just deal with the question of the anomaly first. We do need to appreciate, and I don't think there is an anomaly, in the sense that if you look at the SA, the option 10 was the uncapped need, which was at that point 741.
Yeah.
And it described it as the distribution was based on growth strategy 3 with further development across settlements, including in the AONB. explained a bit about that. It differs from, as a result of that, you have to think about the process. We went through a lot of the responses at the draft stage were about, are we developing too much greenfield land? Is there more scope in urban areas? And the council took that on board, and in producing the pre-submission local plan, it made much more provision in terms of urban intensification, not least through the windfall allowances, as well as development within North Tunbridge Wells, and indeed took out some in the high weald. So the actual, if you like, the distribution in the pre-submission local plan was more focused in terms of sustainable locations, accessible locations in the draft. So there is an apparent anomaly on the scoring, but I don't think it isn't inconsistent, and the council's environmental and sustainability officer is confident that is the position. That said, clearly we are getting towards that position, and I think it's consistent in a way with the fact that council has sought to actually allocate what it feels it reasonably can in terms of sustainable development. If you were to, I'm sure others around the table would say, if we were planning for a 741 figure, it would want a 10 or more larger buffer on top of that as well. And we'd be in a completely different situation in terms of the amount of housing we have to find. What we've actually done is plan for the capped figure, but sought to maximise the potential in terms of sustainable development, and give ourselves, as we say in the plan, that buffer to ensure the delivery of that of the requirement. It is about ensuring the delivery of the requirement, and in that we're confident. So that's the reason.
Okay, I'll take some comments on this. So we'll start with the gentleman at the end, and we'll work our way back down the sides.
Thank you. So just as a reminder, David Neame from Nim Sutton. Apologies for the hand, I don't have a piece of paper, but I mean, we're in the really happy position in the world of standard method that we don't have an argument, and Mr. Ireland and I aren't going to be discussing the calculation. The point I want to raise so comes to the cap, and I think you've summarised really where we were coming from, but I think we need to be clear here that Tunbridge Wells is one of the most expensive authorities to live in the country. In fact, it's the 5th most expensive authority outside of London, based on the most recent affordability ratio data, which was published in March of this year. And just to quantify that in numerical terms, sir, the median workplace-based affordability ratio has risen in the space of the last year by nearly 3 points. It's now 15.42 times the average salary. So the situation has got materially worse in the last 12 months. And that's based on the data published in March and the previous data the government published in March of 21. The reason I raise that, sir, is if we compare that against the UK average of 8.93, it's evident that there is a significant problem here. And that significant problem can only really be overcome by the delivery of further housing. And that's exactly where the PPG is getting at when we are looking at a capped situation here, and the merits of essentially planning for the full need, so the uncapped figure, rather than delaying the delivery of that need, which will inevitably mean that affordability crisis will worsen. Now, I know that Mr. Ireland's covered this point in his matter statement, and he said, well, the relationship between affordability and market housing delivery is a complex one. It's not a straightforward mathematical exercise, and that's correct. But if we just look at a couple of examples where there is a clear correlation between a lack of an up-to-date plan or a plan that is under-providing and a worsening affordability position. We take, for example, Tandridge in Surrey. Tandridge's plan is currently in examination and has been for about 3 years. It's a plan prepared against the 2012 framework. Tandridge's affordability situation is materially worse than we see here at 16.12. And that clearly has worsened during the course of the last 3 years as a result of the lack of delivery, a highly constrained authority without a plan in place. Equally, if we look at an authority like Waverley in Surrey, Waverley wins the Star Prize for the most expensive place to live in the country outside of London. Waverley has a plan which will be 5 years old in February, a 2012 framework plan, an authority that's not managed to deliver a 5-year housing land supply at all since the plan was adopted. Again, a direct correlation between a lack of housing delivery and a material worsening of affordability. That, to my mind, Sarah, is a very powerful argument for why we should be looking at the uncapped figure. I'm not suggesting a figure beyond that, but simply the uncapped figure, which Mr. Ireland has at 741 dwellings per annum. That's all I wanted to say at the moment, sir.
Mr. Neal's taking the words right out of my mouth when it comes to the situation with the affordability ratios. Position in Tunbridge Wells is dire. It is the worst authority in Kent, and outside Surrey actually it's the worst in the south east because it's London, Surrey, and then Tunbridge Wells. And as Mr. Neal's alluded to, it's the 5th worst in the country at the moment. And I think that worsening affordability is something that does justify a review of the figure so that we do look at the uncapped need. I also just wanted to touch on what the essay says about the uncapped need. A lot has been suggested that the essay, in looking at that figure, suggests adverse environmental impacts. I would submit, sir, that there are other options that could have been looked at in terms of spatial distribution strategy in the uncapped need figure within the essay. And that is something that the local authority could have done to increase the overall provision within the borough. There are a number of people around this table that are promoting other sites that they suggest would have provided for additional housing without any adverse impact either on the AONB or the Green Belt. And if that is the case, then why, given the dire affordability situations within this authority, are we looking at a capped figure? Thank you.
Just taking back to the essay, why did in the option 10, then, so option 10 was uncapped 741, growth strategy meets uncapped local housing need, distribution is as per growth strategy 3, I think you said, and that was as per the local plan, was it?
The draft local.
Yeah.
The draft local.
So when you were looking at the uncapped figure to build one point that Ms. Ashley makes there, did you look at other strategies, be that plucked out the air, another new settlement or a large new settlement or additional growth in Tunbridge Wells or additional growth in Paddock Wood? Did you look at different special options to think, okay, well, how are we going to make this figure? And if not, why not?
We looked at those different distributional options in terms of the standard method requirement, and those options didn't perform as well at that level.
So 6, 7.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So those options were considered, and I think the sites that Sasha is referring to, they are within the scope of what was looked at in that additional strategy, and it is, and fully appreciate the affordability. It has always been the case. Tunbridge Wells and Sevenoaks, normally Sevenoaks sort of are towards the top. I don't think it's quite that high, but it's been said. But it's certainly very high, and and it has got worse recently, as we know. House prices have gone up tremendously, and it is as Mr. Neame, I'm sure will appreciate, it is a general picture. You know, the sort of change in tax, stamp duty and availability of properties have had a massive impact. You know, so you know, these things are happening at the moment, and you know, the council is very conscious of it, and that certainly influences how it's looking at affordable housing, which we'll get onto later. But I feel that we've sufficiently assessed the reasonable options. Really, the question is, are the sites individually that you know may be suitable? And I'm sure we'll debate those, but the council's view is that it has assessed the potential for further development.
So just putting aside the say issue for a moment, you know very well, of course, that the relationship between supply and affordability is a very complex one. We're looking here at a step change in terms of provision against historic delivery rates. And there are also market capacity issues which have been identified by Mr. Ireland. But so if it's convenient, I might ask Mr. Ireland to address that issue now, whilst we're on it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, sir. I think it's a starting point. Yeah. In terms of addressing an affordability situation in a borough where basically 2/3 or more of the borough is within the Green Belt or the AONB, the most effective way of increasing delivery short term is by getting a plan in place. I don't think anybody around the room would probably disagree with that. And so I think there are greater benefits from getting a plan in place as soon as possible that can then contribute to delivery in the short term than questions of delay. Now, the other relevant, I think, particularly important factor here is the impact that the constraints have in terms of concentrating development and strategic development in particular parts of the borough. So if you look at our report, sir, on page 68. So you can see in the map in figure 7.4 the area that's outside of the AONB is sort of focused on the northern part, so the northern third really of the district. And what we did is we looked at the trajectories as they were emerging in the plan. And we looked at what the plan trajectory as a whole would imply in terms of rates of housing growth. And if you look at the borough as a whole, we're looking at a delivery rate of 1.5% over the period to the early 2030s. Yeah. And so if I can just compare that to, if you look at our report at page 17. So page 17 shows housing delivery in different local authorities across the country. It shows that a rate of 1.5 would put you in the top few percent of what other authorities have achieved. So our view is, and what the analysis we've done shows, is that there is really very limited potential to deliver more over the period to, say, 2032 in the latest trajectory. And that 1.5% figure holds to 2032, looking at the trajectory that's before the examination. Yeah. So very limited potential to really deliver any more to 2032. So if you then come back to those components within the planning practice guide, it almost sets out two options. You either test putting more in a plan now, or you look at a review mechanism. Our view is that in the context here, that it's better to put a plan in place as quickly as possible. That will have a greater impact in delivery and addressing the affordability issues in the short term. And then the longer term, looking at the trajectory, longer term development needs and where we might where you might go next, because every plan almost gets replaced by another in time. Those longer term development needs beyond 2032 can effectively be dealt with, more effectively be dealt with by review. That has a greater impact in accelerating housing delivery in this area short term than any issue of development.
So, is it the council's position that there should be some form of an early review, or some plans are reviewed every 5 years?
I don't
Is
think
that about right, or?
No, I don't think, yes, it is about right. We're not anticipating an earlier review than that which is required through policy and everything.
That review on a 5 yearly basis is an ample, it's an effective mechanism to deal with development needs and boosting supply in that latter part of the plan period.
Ms. Ashton, you raised your name halfway through. That was a point once.
Just a couple of points, if I may. So the first is on the SA and reasonable alternatives. There is only one strategy outlined in the SA to address the uncapped need. No other alternatives are suggested to the strategy put forward in that, unlike strategies of the capped need, where you have 5 different options setting out how that potentially could be addressed. The second is in terms of this issue of an early review versus actually grappling the nettle and dealing with the situation as it stands now. The affordability issue is only going to get worse. And surely it would be more appropriate to produce a sound plan that actually does address that now rather than leaving it. And the final one is the issue of deliverability and the fact that the authorities say, well, we've not been able to meet these delivery needs in the past, so how are we going to do it now? If we increase it, it's going to be even harder for us to meet the need. The fact of the matter is, and I set it out in my statements, that historically there has been low delivery in Tunbridge Wells, but that has been in part because of a lack of a plan. The core strategy didn't actually provide for strategic sites. They then went through a further DPD. So we had a lull between different plans and delivery support. I accept that, but the fact of the matter is, if you plan properly and you identify sufficient sites, then you will get delivery. The actual situation of affordability in Tunbridge Wells makes it an exceptionally attractive place to develop in. And I cannot believe if you don't deliver identify the sites, they will not deliver. There are sufficient people around this table actually trying to promote sites. I'm not actually doing that. I'm not here to promote an alternative site. My site is actually allocated, but that's not the point. The point is, in terms of actually having a sound plan, you should actually be looking to address the issues as they arise now. And I'm sorry, but I don't accept that dealing with it 5 years hence is dealing with the matter you've got to deal with it.
Okay, we'll take some more representations when we get on the table. That's you sat next to you. Was it Mr. Barrett? Did you? Mr. Barrett, you're up then. You're up then. You were down, I think, were you? No. Okay, Mr. Jones next to you.
So not really got much skin in the game on the point, but I've just become confused. So I'm just really seeking clarification. Mr. Marlowe seemed to be saying to you, and if I've misunderstood, I apologise, that they were going to get to the uncapped need in any event. And so if you set a higher level, it would just push it up. They were going to get in practice to the uncapped need level through this plan because of the way in which delivery operated. And you explored that with him and you said, well, if that's what you're doing, why don't you plan positively? So I thought I understood that bit. And then Mr. Island then came along and then said, no, you've got to, it doesn't matter what it is, sort of thing, get a plan in place, even though it's not going to meet that need, and you at least get delivering some of the need. And then you pressed Mr. Island and Mr. Marlowe and Mr. Chavarri sort of revealed everything, but the review is not going to be an early review, it's going to be the bog standard review. So I'm completely at a loss now with the evidence of Mr. Marlowe, Mr. Island. They don't seem, there seems to be a different story being told. That's, as I say, we've not entered into it, but I'm just listening to it to understand it for its implications for things we have an issue in. At the moment, I can't understand it, but it may be me.
I think the council's position is that that there is no need for an early review, earlier than the 5 years. And that's the council's position. The council considered that that would allow sufficient time for you talked about getting a plan in place and getting things moving. So that in the council's position is where they sit.
And we're planning to meet our capped need and providing a decent buffer to ensure that we do.
I understand that. I understand that's the island position, but the Marlow position was not that. The Marlow position was that that the uncapped need, well, unless it wants to change the evidence, but I misunderstood it, would effectively be met under this plan because of the delivery, and that led you to ask.
Talking about the figures.
Sorry. Can I not be interrupted, please? I may have misunderstood it, but that led the inspector then to say, "Why aren't you planning positively?" So if I had misunderstood it, then I can be explained.
Okay, I think I know.
You've got our position.
Mr. Bond.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I have to say a lot of what I was going to say has also been said, but there are a couple of other points that flow. And one, the first point is, and it should not be forgotten, and the PPG makes it very clear. You've also made it clear, but I have to say it does not come across in any of the council's evidence, either in written form or verbally today, that when a capped figure is introduced, that does not reduce the housing need itself. It doesn't disappear. It's still there and it's still not being met. And the clear advice is, when that occurs, there should be an early review. And my reading of that PPG, that early review is relative to the bog standard 5-year review. So in other words, it's earlier than the 5-year review. That's the first one. The second point, sir, is that when councils introduce a buffer, that buffer's there to almost not guarantee, but try and secure the delivery of the capped figure, 678. It's not there to secure the higher uncapped requirement. So putting it another way, that buffer figure is almost like a second-class form of housing requirement, because they won't include that within the 5-year housing land supply calculations. That will be based upon the capped figure. And there's still no guarantee, when one is looking at positive plan making, that the buffer will be secured plus the capped requirement. The next point that I'd like to raise is that, again, when one hears about the need for an early review, Mr. Marlow at one point said that there will be no need for a review, despite what the PPG is saying, because they feel that, oh no, the buffer will be taken up in addition to all the other assumptions baked in to get to the lower figure. And that suggests to me that there is no real appetite to do what the PPG says they should do in the circumstances which they have chosen to follow. The next point, when I read the PPG and the issue of the capped figure, that relates to a ultimate requirement that is deliverable. And my reading of the word deliverable is not one that is related to planning constraints. Might be a market point, but not a planning constraints point. So when the council say, we can't deliver any more because of the existence of the AONB and Green Belt, that, in my view, is the incorrect test. And when the council say, as they've done in their Matter 2 statement, we can't deliver any more in areas beyond the Green Belt and the AONB, again, that is the wrong approach and test. And moreover, as we'll come on to later today, the council quite rightly accepts that there is no absolute protection to Green Belt and AONB. And I'll highlight those paragraphs later when you raise those questions. So again, that should not be used as an excuse to either plan positively for a formal requirement level that includes the uncapped correct housing need figure. And then I think it was made down the line here, in terms of the affordability ratio, yes, this council was one of the worst performing. And just to put it in context, there are 309 English councils. And this is close to the top 10. And it's the worst in Kent. And its neighbour, Sevenoaks, is the second worst. So again, locally, there is a real issue that needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed today. The other point, sir, is that they talk about a step change compared to the core strategy. The core strategy has a requirement of 300 dwellings per annum. And that, as I'm sure most of us all know, stemmed from the good old South East Plan. And we all know what the South East Plan said. That was a policy constrained figure where they accepted it did not relate to the level of housing need, which is why one of the reasons this government has sought to try and rectify that. So to compare what they're seeking to do with that previous development plan requirement is, I believe, slightly misleading and certainly artificial. Then the last point, sir, is obviously I would, as a number of people on this side of the argument, would request that the plan be amended in terms of the requirement to reflect the uncapped figure. But if you weren't to do that, I would put that the plan itself, rather than just being lost in this room and lost in all these EIP statements, that the plan itself, through policy, requires and states that there will be an early review, I'd say an imminent review, to address these housing needs that are not being met and do not be sidetracked by the buffer, because I repeat, that is a second-rate form of requirement that is not actually being counted, and it is not there to deliver a higher figure. It's there to try and underpin the lower figure. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. Mr. Bond has just made many of the points I wanted to make with respect to attaining a positively prepared plan, but having listened to the council's response, what I think is still unclear to me at least is why option 10, which is the uncapped need through the SA, was rejected in favour of the pre-submission local plan growth option, which is delivering in excess of the option 10 level of growth. So why not, if the council accept they can accommodate the actual minimum needs of the area and acknowledge that even this is unlikely to address the acute shortage of affordable housing in the borough, which I'll come on to in your subsequent questions.
surely in accordance with the NPPG, the housing requirement should, as a minimum, comprise the actual figure of 13,338 homes. And this is without accounting for the affordability adjustments or unmet needs of the adjoining authorities, which we'll go on to next. Clearly, to me, having listened to what we've discussed today, the decisions the council took in distributing such growth through their SA clearly had a bearing on the outcome of their assessment of option 10. And as Ms. Ashton has alluded to, reasonable alternatives may have been identified for particular settlements or sites that could make a contribution to meeting some of this unmet need, even if not all. And given how acute the housing need is in this area, any such contribution, no matter how small, surely assist the council demonstrate that they've produced a more positively prepared plan, paragraph 35 of the PDF. So.
Okay, just finally before we come back to council, there's a couple of names that's got up. So we'll start at the far end and with the gentleman with the glasses and we'll work down.
So, listening to this is a bit like listening to medieval scholars debating how many angels could sit on a pin. Whilst they were impressed by the altruism of the developer interests in seeking apparently to reduce the price crisis, this was still not solved before the crisis in World Tunbridge Wells. The need is very clearly for affordable and maybe social housing, which market developers are generally not very interested in building, and unfortunately for which public finance is still not available. We have a very severe problem in Tunbridge Wells, but I've put it to so that it's not specifically related to the numbers. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I know we're dealing with affordable housing under another issue as well, but I think there are some statistics there that are at least relevant to this issue of affordability and affordability ratios as well. Refer you to the review of affordable housing needs in the core document. But table 3.7 of that document refers to the affordable rented need of 323 homes per annum and an affordable home ownership need of 347 homes per annum. If you add those two together, the total is 670. So the picture that paints is that planning for the minimum standard need figure is only just getting over and above the combined affordable housing need in the borough. And in our view, that presents a compelling need to increase the minimum requirement in the plan.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to pick up on the point, excuse me, that Mr. Bond made about the options that are available for an earlier review. And just wanted to say that obviously at the moment, the figures, whatever the figure is that you decide the council is promoting is a minimum. And obviously the more that can be done is going to, within the plan period, could happen. But at the moment, we don't want to exacerbate the affordability issue that has been discussed. And therefore, a plan needs to be put in place as soon as possible to release the land from Green Belt. We can't do that until the plan is adopted. And therefore, it is essential that an early adoption as possible is achieved. Now, recently, Brentwood Borough Council, that has a higher percentage of Green Belt than here, has adopted its plan in March this year, and they put in, as Mr. Bond suggested, a policy that actually that stipulated, that had been agreed with the inspectors, stipulated a review and submission of a partial review of the plan within 28 months. And I'm just saying, sir, that that has been done in that circumstance, and that is an option that's available to you.
Okay, I'll take any responses from the council. Do you want to sort of move on?
I think Mr. Bond actually has something else to say.
Anything?
Just one last point, which forgive me, sir, I did mean to make, and that was, I mean, I hope it's not a recurring theme, but last time I was here anyway, back in March, I had a bit of a polite critique of the council's sustainability appraisal where they had not looked at my client's revised scheme. And I think that has even more, and I said it for a reason anyway, but that has even more relevance in light of what we've heard today, in that the council's A&O, we've looked at through the sustainability appraisal all the options, including meeting the uncapped level of need. Well, frankly, certainly from my client's perspective, they have not. And what I said back in March, I feel still stands today. And that does provide a mechanism by which they can have a sounder and more legal and a legally compliant approach to what is a very important issue. Thank you.
It's just a really quick point in response to Mr. Ryan. I think building some of the other points, but it's really with regard to the market to provide the homes in this area. I think it sort of comes on to the next issue in terms of the delivery coming in from London and the influence of the London market within this area. There's clearly unmet needs, which we'll go into in the next issues, next question. But the market is there. We look at the affordability ratios that Mr. Neem raised, and from that same evidence, there is also the case that look at the median house price, which in the last year rose from 390,000 to 430,450. That's a significant increase in price, which shows that there is actually a significant constraint within this market, and one that actually could support a level of delivery higher than what is being suggested. I think what isn't there is a consideration of a strategy early on that would meet that. And I think that is, coming on to issues around Matter 9 in terms of actually looking at those sites and types of sites that can come forward earlier in the plan to ensure that those come forward. So it's not just looking at the needs, it's looking at the types of strategy. I would suggest that the market is clearly there in terms of when you look at the evidence in terms of affordability, in terms of cost of housing, to support that level of delivery. It's ensuring that the type of sites are there within the strategy, and the strategy being considered to deliver those. So I think that's an important element to take into account when considering strategies and what should have been considered. Bringing a plan forward early is quickly is vital, but it's also ensuring that actually the right strategy is considered at that point, rather than saying, coming to this point and saying, oh, we need a plan now. So I think it's looking at it not just now, but what should have been done throughout the plan making process.
There is only one view on this side of the table. Mr. Ireland presented, one aspect of it. I presented the other. It's entirely consistent. Essentially, what we've done is looked at deliverability. That's the wording of the PPG, and I'll come back to that. And in essence, the cap is there. It is part of the standard method. There are exceptional circumstances needed to not go with it. And we're conscious one aspect of that is deliverability. And we are confident that we can deliver the capped figure. We're less confident about the uncapped figure. We're less confident, we're certainly not confident about it being the base for the plan. It raises clear issues in terms of sustainability. I think in terms of Ms. Ashton's point, in terms of the strategy, we did look at other options. They weren't as sustainable as option 3. We looked at 3+ essentially. But we also, and I think this is critical, sir, we looked at all the sites that were submitted to us, and that resulted in essentially somewhat more supply than the capped figure. And we haven't put a ceiling on that, right? If they're suitable sites, we will put those forward. If they all come forward, then as I said, that we may get to that point, but we're not in a position to be sure about that. So it seems to me that the most appropriate is essentially the default, the capped figure. In terms of the PPG, if I can just make 2 points. One is Mr. Bond said, there should be an early review. It doesn't actually say that. It actually says what I said, and that there may need to be one. And that was my emphasis, that there may need to be one. And we stand by that. But on the basis of where we are at the moment, I don't think it is necessary, but it may become necessary. And finally, I point to, there is actually a paragraph in the PPG, and so I'm sure you're aware of it anyway, but paragraph 2A10, which says, when might it be appropriate to plan for a higher housing need figure than the standard method indicates? And we'll come on to neighbouring authorities, which is one of the issues, but are there growth strategies in the area? Like you can understand a situation where there may be perhaps the push, South Hampshire, Portsmouth area where there was a clear growth strategy. That doesn't apply in this area. Are there strategic infrastructure improvements that are likely to drive an increase in homes need? No, there's no particular strategic infrastructure of that sort of scale here that apply to the borough. So, we have, my point is, we have considered all these issues and come to, I feel, sort of reasonable conclusion that the capped figure is the correct one.
Okay, I want to move on. I just want to put up the next answer question. I want to spend probably a good chunk of time discussing questions 5 and 6, really, because obviously then what would you do to do? Question 3 in Matt's issues and questions was obviously in addition to levy housing needs, Welsh, Carls, and housing needs not being accommodated in neighbouring areas. Now, I don't have any further questions on this. Obviously, we spent a good sort of day and a half talking about duty to cooperate. We've had a lot on the history of Seven Oaks and why Seven Oaks are in their plan preparation and other neighbouring authorities as well. So I don't have any further questions, comments, or observations on question 3. But I will open it to the room if anybody does wish to make any points. Mr. Neil, should we go this way down?
So I'm grateful. Sorry, I was allowing the debate to unfold in respect of the cap before making contribution in respect to question 2. I can very briefly, I think, more matter of clarification before coming on to question 3. Safe Capable is clearly going to be swimming against the tide of the views expressed to my right on this one. But we set out under the question of whether there are exceptional circumstances which justify an alternative approach to the same method. We raised a query in our position statement at paragraphs 14 to 16 about this, whether it's really right that it's the 2018 ONS projection figures shouldn't be used. Now, I accept entirely that, of course, the PPG, what PPG says about the 2018 versus the 2014 use of those ONS figures, and it comes up in most examinations. I've been to, in fact, in the Norfolk local plan examination last month. This was debated as well. But Safe Capable looked at the ICENIA report, and as we understand it, Mr. Ireland saying, well, Tunbridge Wells isn't an outlier nationally when it comes to looking at the 2014-2018 projections, so there's no reason to use the 2018 projections. But our query is this, is that there is evidence, at least in table 5.7 of Mr. Ireland's report to the ICENIA report, that Tunbridge Wells does have a particularly low level of population growth compared to other authorities within the area, so within Kent and the surrounding area. And Safe Capable is struggling to understand why that particular fact is being discounted in looking at whether or not, in fact, the lower population growth figures for 2018, whether it would be proportionate and reasonable to use those figures. And it's just that point of clarification that we would seek from Mr. Ireland, because Safe Capable's position is that it seems on the face of it that there is some justification to go towards those lower demographic predictions in the 2018 ONS figures.
Okay, to come back to my point and then we'll
get some clarification.
So Yes, sir. I mean, table 5.7 shouldn't be read in isolation. So 5.7 sets out what those projections show, but then the subsequent pages of the report then go into to unpick that. It looks at the components of change within the projections. Looks at natural change, figure 5.6. Looks at net migration in 5.7. What we find is that the driver of the difference between, say, 2014 and 2018 based projections is particularly less projected natural change, less births, higher deaths relative to that previous projection. But that's consistent with the pattern of those ONS projections around the country. So if that was a reason to move away from the 2014 projections, it wouldn't just apply here; it would apply everywhere else. And I think it's for those, but that's not what planning practice guidance says. Planning practice guidance there says that essentially the more recent projections should be used. So we don't see in those terms that there's a set of exceptional circumstances based on the local data for Tunbridge Wells is different from the national position.
So if I won't come back on that particular point, but if we're going to move beyond question 3, would it be appropriate I now address you on that point? I appreciate you don't want us to repeat everything.
Yeah, what I want to do is I want to have a break and then come back and sort of spend a good bit of time talking about questions 5 and 6. As I say, in terms of question 4 was a point of clarification for the council. Really. In terms of question 3, should I make provision for housing needs not naming areas? So I've got all the evidence I need from written statements. I don't need to sort of hear people regurgitate what they've already said. It was more if anybody had any other sort of burning points of question 3 they wanted to make that we've not already heard.
I think we're content to refer to our previous submissions on that one and what we set out in 1921 of our position statement.
So it is just one point, and it's all set out in terms of London. And I think London is the big concern across the South East. It is the elephant in the room that is not addressed, and I think it's just come down to a point that Mr. Marlowe just raised, in that they were talking about neighbouring authorities. And in this case, it's not about neighbouring authorities. As you point out, sir, it is about neighbouring areas, and that comes to the heart of paragraph 61 of the MPPF. Tunbridge Wells is in an HMA that does adjoin the London housing market area. London cannot meet its needs. It's not been able to meet its needs in terms of the London plan for since the London plan was submitted with a 10,000 home shortfall, and as we went through examination, that shortfall has increased significantly, and that is what needed to be considered as part of the thing. The London plan, the targets were reduced, not on the basis of need, but basis of capacity, and those points have not been taken on board by the council as it's gone through in terms of the preparation of this plan, in terms of actually what that impact on, in terms of things like the uncapped needs, in terms of the market. And I think this comes back to the point I was raising before, in that it's important that should have been fed into the process and the understanding that the council has taken forward with regard to the housing need and the housing requirement and what that should be. And I think it's that difficult if the concentration is on what is in neighbouring authorities rather than in neighbouring areas, and looking at that more strategic issue. Recognise it is for all authorities across the South East to deliver. It's something that the council said, yes, they were aware of it in the duty to cooperate, and some as part of the South East of England councils have been working on that. But the failure to deliver or to address any of that strategic, that means that it falls to individual local authorities across the South East to actually start considering it in terms of their local plans. I would prefer it to be dealt with strategically and for a joint and shared approach to be made. I think we would all done that, we would prefer that. But it hasn't happened, so therefore it falls back. The London Mayor has effectively washed his hands of that situation, so it now falls to individual local authorities to start looking at that and the impacts on each of their local plans. So That's the point I would like to make, and I refer to in terms of the evidence in my statements and representations, but it is an issue that hasn't really been addressed or considered fully by the council.
Sorry, Mr. Jones.
So I just got 3 short points, and then Mrs. Miles has got 1. And they are very short. I'm not going to repeat what's set out in our statements, but first, again, the position now adopted by the council in respect of 7/8 district council's unmet need is to reiterate the point that's just been made by Mr. Brett. We're looking at the market, not the local authority. So the market is the West Kent housing market. And to suggest that there's no unmet need from Sevenoaks is ridiculous. When you look that Sevenoaks is still not formally withdrawn its April letter. And the evidence we've heard today about affordability, Sevenoaks District Council is up there with numbers as well. So the suggestion that there's not going to be any unmet need is just absurd, frankly. Those are the 3 points we make. I don't reiterate other points of Ms. Martin.
It's just to pick up on a point related to question 3 that's actually in the answer to question 2 of the Council's matter statement. So at paragraph 28, the council refers you to the PPG and the 3 tests where exceptional circumstances, and Mr. Marlowe just touched on that. And the third point is about the unmet need from neighbourhood authorities. And then at paragraph 29, the council tells you that there is no unmet need in the West Kent market area. So my question is, if you look at the council's housing needs assessment topic paper, para 2.21, it refers there to the Orsini report, and it says the Orsini report concludes that there are not the exceptional circumstances to justify an alternative approach. And then I can just take you to the Orsini report in paragraph 3.19. It states there, consideration of unmet needs from other areas is an important part of plan making process, but is not an issue considered within this report. So my question is, where is it in the evidence base? Where was it considered whether or not the unmet need from Sevenoaks was an exceptional circumstance?
Okay, yeah, lady.
Lisa Skinner on behalf of Roscom Strategic. Several just quick points. Generally in relation to the Sevenoaks position, we provided evidence at that local plan examination, and obviously you'll be aware, so in terms of how the council didn't intend to meet its objectively assessed housing need. The strategy that Sevenoaks took was not accepted by the inspector. And also it went further in relation to the actual site assessments was flawed. There was incorrect definitions taken on land assessments and site assessments within the NPPF. And that also led to the overall Green Belt assessment to be flawed. That meant in terms of actually saying they weren't meeting their housing need, a massive question when you were saying you couldn't meet it, but you fundamentally assessed sites wrong. So from our perspective, there were no surprises that the inspector had to write a report in vain that occurred. In the circumstances here, we believe that Tunbridge Wells has attempted to learn from those lessons. They are trying to get a plan in place. That's important, as everyone around this table has said, to provide some form of certainty and to allow delivery. And we think that's important for them to get a plan in place that provides developers and others in the market and affordability that something can actually happen in accordance with an adopted local plan.
Thank you, sir. David Mayer from Barton Wilmore. Sir, appreciate you're fully versed in the circumstances with Sevenoaks, so I won't go near that one. But my point relates to 2 other adjacent authorities, being Tunbridge and Malling and Wheeldon District Council. Both authorities currently have a significant uplift on their previous core strategy regimes. Tunbridge and Malling have a standard method of 843 DPA. Wheeldon is 1,125 DPA, and those figures are set out in table 1 of my matter statement, sir. There's constraints in those authorities: Green Belt, National Park, Ramsar sites, and both authorities are also presently pleading with ministers to reduce their standard method needs. So I think there's an uncertain picture there as well, so with those two authorities going forward. Not one right now, possibly for this council to have to grapple with, but to my mind, it certainly calls for either an increased buffer later in the plan period, perhaps, or as has been suggested, I don't know how it's been called, an earlier than early review in the plan. So those are one points.
Okay.
I'll ask Mr. Bourne just to update you, sir, as far as necessary in relation to adjoining authorities.
Thank you, sir. The statements of common ground with Tunbridge and Malling, Wheeldon, Rother set out that there is no unmet need from those authorities. At the time that they were signed, there is still no unmet need from those authorities. There have been no requests from those made since the submission of the plan. I'll come on to talk about London shortly. In terms of Sevenoaks, I think, sir, it's worth just very, very briefly recapping on the chronology. On the 6th of February 2019, Jonathan Ball, in his advisory visits to Sevenoaks, wrote that the bar that Sevenoaks were using in terms of their exceptional circumstances for leasing Greenbelt, which was essentially that significant infrastructure had to be delivered to the benefit of the existing community. He raised significant concerns about that, and I'll come back to that point, sir. The April 2019 request from Sevenoaks to meet unmet need, the statement of common ground signed with Sevenoaks sets out that the request and the figure can no longer be relied on. And again, sir, we discussed that at length in the duty to cooperate sessions. The plan that Sevenoaks has not been withdrawn, but it is dead, and the request that was made on the back of that is accordingly the weight that could be attached that the council considers is nil. The response to the question sets out what Sevenoaks is doing in terms of its new local plan. It is undertaking considerable additional evidence gathering, and that's set out in paragraph 42, and I won't repeat it. It all identifies the scope for additional housing to be accommodated. Importantly, if there is then a need for Sevenoaks to look at the Green Belt, having worked through paragraph 141, it will then be a case of Sevenoaks considering whether there are exceptional circumstances to warrant the release of land from the Green Belt. And it's only after that that we will know whether there is unmet housing need or not from Sevenoaks. So in a duty to cooperate meeting between Tunbridge Wells, Sevenoaks and Tunbridge and Malling held on the 11th of May, Sevenoaks confirmed that in terms of exceptional circumstances, at the site level, a different approach to exceptional circumstances is likely to be deployed at this time, i.e. for this plan, which is less focused on the delivery of significant pieces of infrastructure, although supporting infrastructure is still considered crucial on strategic sites. Essentially, the bar that Sevenoaks had before in relation to exceptional circumstances, which led to the unmet need in the previous plan, is being lowered. That's their approach. They've set that out in a duty to cooperate discussion. So, sir, the council's conclusions that there is not, and I'll be careful here about using a double negative, the council's conclusions are that there is not unmet need. There is no unmet need from Sevenoaks at this point, or at the point of submission. And so The other update that Sevenoaks gave is that they're, in terms of the timing for producing the plan, Regulation 19 consultation is not expected now until spring 2024. So that would, in terms of whether there is need and any unmet need, and whether there is any expense, and the extent of any unmet need, would not be known until that point. So I hope that addresses the question that was raised and provides a useful update in terms of Sevenoaks. In terms of London, I set out in the duty to cooperate discussions that there had been no direct requests from the GLA or from any adjoining authorities around unmet need or difficulties to meet need from the London authorities. Mr. Ryan will just provide a further comment on that.
So yes, just one further point in respect of London, which is it is worth looking at the content of the London Plan panel report. And the panel report identifies that a Green Belt review should be undertaken as a means to deliver housing and industrial development within London. That's set out quite clearly within that document. Clearly, that review could impact on housing delivery in London and therefore on unmet need.
It's paragraphs 4, 5, 3 onwards.
Okay. Any final points? I don't really want to get back into this Sevenoaks issue. I don't want to hear any more on it.
So just a quick point with regard to Mr. Ryan's just come to London in terms of review. Yes, recognise the points that were made there, but it also is looking at the unmet need for London between 2018 and 2028. So there is unmet need within that plan period, and then moving forward, there would be a review of that London plan, and then but that would likely look well beyond that in terms of delivery of needs and Green Belt reviews. We're looking at unmet needs now, and from 2018 to 2028. I think that's the important consideration. Thank you, sir.
Just procedural, I made submissions otherwise. Again, it's a thing that's troubling, and I think that we're getting material spoken about orally about now the duty to cooperate. Are there minutes of these meetings available, and are they on the website? It was a problem, and it's an issue that we think wasn't resolved at the last duty to cooperate, that we're just told what's been agreed and what hasn't been agreed. I'm resisting to make the point, but I won't, that the fact that Sevenoaks won't even get round to producing a plan makes, as we made with the points we made with the London plan, even more ridiculous to suggest that there's unmet need. But so I know you don't want to hear any more about that, but I do ask, as a matter of fairness and proper procedure, we need to put a stop to this. Now, if I'm told that they're available on the website, that's fine, but it would be helpful as well if we could be notified. So first question is, are they now on the website? So in this slide, you can't find them at the moment, but are they on there? And if not, why not?
Which minutes are you referring to?
Well, we've just been told there was a meeting in May where Sevenoaks.
Yeah, I don't. Let's work on the basis of the documents we've got for this examination. You know, meetings continue, plan preparation continues in other authorities, it's ongoing. So I don't need to see any more documents, meetings, minutes on that issue. Hence why I didn't even really want to discuss it today.
Well, so I've only been meeting the case that's now relied upon. We were being told by the officers that it was an incredibly important point.
We've got the council's position set out in statements of ground, etc. that we discussed in the last session. Don't need to go there. Again, Mr. Bond.
Thank you, sir. I was going to make a wider point, but I'm going to resist that. In preparation for today, I went through the affordability ratios to rank where Tunbridge Wells comes. And what you get is all the London authorities, and then you go into bits of Surrey like Elmbridge, Waverley, then you get to Sevenoaks. You get to, sorry, Tunbridge Wells. And if you just step back for a second in this, what is supposed to be a very sophisticated economy and, I dare say, planning system, there are lots of significant issues in neighbouring areas that are simply not being met. And I'm struggling to not say this, but I'm going to say it. It just takes one inspector to look at the bigger picture and say, this issue in this part of the southeast and to the south of London needs to be addressed. And if it could be addressed in a positive, constructive way, rather than just kicking the can yet further and further down the road, I genuinely believe that will be a very positive step forward for us all. There's a bit of a plea there, sir. But you just look at the figures geographically, and it is not good. And nothing's been done about it. And I genuinely believe this is a case and a plan that should step up to the plate and do the right thing and make a contribution. Thank you.
Okay, first we'll take break. Just slightly behind that. I think we should do okay. So I do want to spend a good chunk of time on questions 5 and 6, which we've already taken together. And that starts to move the topic of conversation towards really obviously we've looked at the numbers, and it's then what you actually do and how you start applying to those numbers. So I suggest we'll take a break. 10 minutes, okay, everybody? Is that about right? Yeah. Okay, we'll adjourn and resume back at 5:02, please. continue. I think we've got everyone. Just okay, so as I said before, really this next section of questions, and I want to start to consider, talk about the number, what the number should be, and plenty for sort of consider there. But I want to take this forward, and this starts to sort of take the examination forward as well, really. So what do you actually start to do with something? And questions 5 and 6 can probably be taken together, actually. There's some sort of different issues in there, but I think at a sort of high level, probably taken together. And as a starting point, I think within the matters, issues, and questions actually included some of the national planning policy framework and what that says about sustainable development and what to do with plan making. And that talks there about strategic policies should, as a minimum, provide for progressively assess needs for housing and other uses, as well as any needs that cannot be met within neighbouring areas, unless, and then it gives two points. And what the framework there talks about is whether the application of policies in the framework that protect areas or assets of particular importance provide a strong reason for restricting the overall scale, type, or distribution of development in the plan area, or if any adverse impact of doing so will significantly demonstrate outweigh the benefits when assessing the policies in the framework section as a whole. And from representations and the council's statements, we know that the National Planning Policy Framework allows the councils to make alterations to Green Belt boundaries through preparation of a local plan. We know that that's what the council's done. But I want to spend a bit of time just exploring the framework and what that says, and whether or not anybody feels that what the framework there is saying, yes, meet your housing needs, but actually areas such as AONBs, Green Belts potentially, or any other planning constraints mean that you shouldn't meet needs. So just sort of take that point first, right? We know what the framework says about altering Green Belt boundaries. But does anybody think that the framework also gives directions to what we should do in instances like this, where we talked about the constraints, we've talked about the area of land covered by AONBs, Green Belts, etc. The lady with the glasses can work away about that.
Thank you for letting me kick off on this one. So I represent CPRE Kent, which is the countryside charity. So in brief, I would say that there are policies that provide a strong reason for restricting the scale of development in Tunbridge, and that the housing requirements should be adjusted to reflect that. Although we didn't comment on duty to cooperate because our district committee was very concerned that we wanted to delay the preparation of the plan. Obviously, there will be ways of, if the council doesn't meet the full need and lowers its requirement, that there would be mechanisms for allowing housing elsewhere. And we don't talk about duty to cooperate, but you'll see from our other hearing statements that we very much want to look at the density on housing sites, and the greater the yield, the less land take. And in a nutshell, that is what our representations are.
So I think your question is directed, correct if I'm wrong, in terms of the NPPF tests at paragraph 140 and onwards. I mean, so capable of without repeating everything that we've said previously, and that we will say when it comes to the Greenbelt session, we say that when looking at exceptional circumstances test, the NPPF is clear that, I'm citing from 141 now, the strategic policy making authority should be able to demonstrate that it has examined fully all other reasonable options for meeting its identified need for development. I stress the word fully. I also think it's relevant to look at 141C, because that states that this question will be assessed in the examination, which will take into account whether the strategy has been informed by discussions with neighbouring authorities, etc. Now, I'm not going to absolutely take the point we don't want to go back over the duty to cooperate submissions of previous session, but therefore it's absolutely clear in terms of where you are constrained by Green Belt and indeed your AONB. It's absolutely fundamental that discussions with other authorities have been carried out exhaustively, and that in our submission has simply not taken place here. And I'm not going to repeat the fact that their discussion, we've already heard discussions are ongoing, but on any level, this is not exhaustive discussions have not taken place. Second point is, of course, and this links into question 4. One of the factors, it may be the reason things are being a bit rough, is that, of course, normally in paragraph 22 of the framework, one would have a 30-year horizon for a plan that allocates strategic sites. I just want to make this a short point. Of course, here, the 15-year horizon was allowed to be adopted by the authority because of the Reg 19, because of the transitional provisions. But the reason I make this point is just because it all points to this being done in a bit of a rush. Both in terms of gathering the evidence and in terms of that engagement with local authorities. And I just wanted that point not to be lost in before we look in detail at the Green Belt and AONB and the exceptional circumstances test. But that's so capable sort of point in a nutshell, but the NPPF is clear that what you do is going to look at other authorities, go and have discussions with neighbouring authorities and really get to the bottom of whether they can assist in taking some of that identified need before setting your requirements. And we say that just simply hasn't happened here on the facts. Thank you, sir.
So is it your position that the framework isn't saying, well, you've got an authority that's heavily constrained, therefore you don't need to meet meetings for. So you're sort of accepting that the framework, it's not saying that, it's sort of saying you can, also Green Belt boundaries. Or are you saying that the framework is actually saying no, you really haven't constrained areas, Green Belt, this is your housing need, but actually, we're not the same as other authorities, which you wouldn't constrain in those terms. Therefore, the requirement should be low.
That is exactly the point, the latter. Of course, when you're setting the requirements, you have to take into account and look at the exceptional circumstances test for reviewing Green Belt boundaries. Of course you do, because otherwise you come up with a completely arbitrary and unrealistic requirement that won't be met or deliverable. So we say it's exactly the exceptional circumstances test is integral when setting the housing requirement. You've got to go through those tests and look at whether it justifies lowering the requirement.
Also, in terms of the paragraph 1.4, we've touched upon sort of point C, which is about talking to your neighbours, and we will, as the days go on, touch on the other points about density, etc. So your position then, should an authority that's heavily constrained by Green Belt, they know what the minimum need is, and then from getting from your housing need to your housing requirement should go through then this process of looking at densities, looking at brownfield sites, talking to neighbours, etc., carrying out Green Belt reviews. And is it your position that ultimately if they then do that process and can't meet that figure in a just sensible and sustainable way, then the NPPF is saying, well, you don't just go and set a figure and just allocate sites regardless?
Well, I think that's our position, exactly. I mean, if you have to go through that process first before selling it. We say that process hasn't been carried out in any events, but it's it is an integral part of considering what should happen with the requirement, right? And that's why we say things have gone wrong here. That there was no proper consideration to lowering the requirement at that on the basis of those discussions, which weren't carried out and said at the right time in any event.
So let's say, obviously appreciate your position, but let's say for argument's sake that we accept for the sake of this discussion, we accept that the council went through that process and they talked to their neighbours and they asked their neighbours and they said, no, we can't help you. So the council's left in a situation where it's got a housing need figure, whether that's the full need or the capped figure, it's got a figure. It knows that its neighbours can't assist in that regard. It knows that it's constrained by AONB, by Green Belt. What do you think that the council didn't do, should have done differently? Because presumably the council then went to start looking at sites. Well, how can we meet this? We need to start doing some assessments of land parcels to understand whether we can do this or not. Is that the right way of doing it? If we accept that they talked to their neighbours and accept that was robust, but that's one side. Presumably the next step then is for the council to actually start unpicking sites and thinking about strategies, where it can go, the harm might be caused, etc.
Absolutely, and interrogating in much further scrutiny whether in fact the strategy that they've adopted is actually realistic, or going back and having a look at other sites and really understanding whether or not those sites, in light of that higher requirement that followed on the basis that nothing fruitful came out of these authorities, having a closer look at those other sites. We've heard Mr. Bond's here promoting one site, we know sites around Horsenden, etc. And going back to the drawing board and thinking, is this putting all your eggs in the two garden settlement strategy, the right one, or does everything have to be thrown up in the air again? And go back to the drawing board and look and see what the appropriate strategy is. We say that second look and that sanity check of the two garden settlement strategies didn't take place. And we've made that quite clear in our submissions in relation to the SA. The council was set on a single track, and there's no real evidence that it went back and had a closer look once. On its case, it realised that no other authorities would help it meeting its need.
So is your position in that scenario then that it was the council's obviously site selection, revamp methodology, all these things which will probably start to unpick this week. In your position has led to a site allocation that isn't justified, effective, etc. Shouldn't be in the plan. So is that your position rather than, well, no, once the council had exhausted the discussions with neighbouring authorities, the default should have been, well, actually, let's lower the housing requirement. So is it more about actually the wrong sites than the council's process of actually releasing Green Belt to meet its needs?
Well, we say both, because I don't think those two positions are logically inconsistent. Clearly, Safe Capel says that the site selection strategy went wrong as a result of the lack of scrutiny of what other neighbouring authorities were saying about meeting needs. But again, it could have, one of the prior question which you've asked is, should it look at actually lowering its housing requirements as well? We say that there's just simply insufficient evidence that was properly scrutinised again in light of what was being said by other neighbouring authorities. But the two approaches, i.e., do you lower your requirement altogether, or do you go back and have a look at whether there are sites that could, or a different strategy that could meet that higher requirement? Both of those exercises should have been carried out. We say they weren't.
Okay, so your position is, yeah, what was council doing that? Should have gone back to the drawing board. Right, okay. Can we really meet these needs? And sort of taking that sort of step back and asking those questions again. Mr. Bond?
Thank you, sir. The straight answer to your question is no, those two policies do not provide a strong reason for restricting the scale of development in the buffer. The second point that flows from that is that when you look at those policies in the framework, there are a number of paragraphs within the framework in relation to the Green Belt which clearly indicate that there is no, I'm going to use the words of the council, paragraph 53 of their matter 2 statement, there is no absolute protection. There are, and quite rightly so, there is a degree of flexibility through the exceptional circumstances that allows Green Belt to be, or Green Belt boundaries to be reviewed and land taken out of the Green Belt. And in relation to the AONB, again, the council at paragraph 80 and 90, their matter 2 statements, also confirm that the framework does not simply dismiss major development proposals in an AONB on principle. Again, and that is a correct interpretation of the section or the suite of paragraphs within the framework regarding the AONB. And it's clear within the AONB, clear within the framework that local plans can review and amend Green Belt boundaries. Within the framework and AONBs, there is no hook or policy to amend AONB boundaries, but there is policy guidance that permits, again, in exceptional circumstances, development within the AONB. And the council are right in their statement to confirm that those paragraphs do not provide an absolute constraint. Yes, great weight to be applied to the absolute wording correct. Great weight should be given to conserving and enhancing landscape and scenic beauty in national parks and AONBs. That's not saying no development whatsoever. There are still circumstances where major development can still be permitted within the AONB, either through, rightly so, a plan making allocation process, and obviously through applications. Now, I could get a little I could get a bit confused when you read paragraph 177, because that's within the context of considering applications as opposed to plan making. But an example of major development allocated in the AONB in Dorset was tested also through the courts. I've got that in my regulation 19 statement, where the judgment seemed to be applying the tests of 177 to a plan making process. And I'm sure the barristers either side of me, I would be wrong to question the judgment of the court. But even if you were to apply 177 to plan making, that still, in a similar sense and way to the Green Belt, provides the circumstances for development within an AONB. The Compton Parish Council case in Guildford confirms that the phrase exceptional circumstances applies both to Green Belt and AONB, can encompass development needs. And the council have accepted in their justification for development within the Green Belt that need comprises an exceptional circumstance. Council have also accepted in relation to employment development within the AONB, exceptional circumstances through need. And there's no reason why that same point can't equally apply to housing. And I suppose the context of your question, as far as I'm concerned, is do those two policies restrict the scale of development beyond the current requirement of the uncapped figure? And I don't believe they do for some of the reasons I've just alluded to, albeit at a high level. And it's a point that I suppose goes back to the discussion before the break. You've got a capped level of need. That doesn't remove that housing need. PPG says that's still got to be planned through an early review. The Green Belt's here today, the AONB is here today, and those two policy considerations will still be there tomorrow. Nothing's going to change. That need, according to policy and the PPG, still needs to be met. It still requires, quite clearly, additional development within the AONB, within the Green Belt, and potentially also in the AONB. And if it's in the right location, and I'm not going to get into site specifics, if it's in the right location and can be mitigated through what the council have done in terms of Paddock Wood and Cheadle Village through master planning exercises, there is still scope for those additional requirements to meet the identified needs to be met in the AONB and Green Belt locations.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you, sir. Like the point made previously about NPPF paragraph 22 about the government introduced in 2021 into the NPPF about larger scale developments such as new settlements or significant extensions to existing villages and towns. We feel like this part of that policy was really, it's really written for Tunbridge Wells local plan, because that's really what this plan is trying to achieve. It's its overall strategy. It's locating its strategic development on urban extensions and through new garden settlements. The reason why the government brought that in is because the issue with a lot of these strategic sites and new settlements that I think a lot of us have suffered through the years, I know I have, is in terms of the actual delivery of these sites and the lack of upfront infrastructure in terms of what's actually going to be required to support new housing development. I think what you're hearing around the table from developers and their representatives is that just allocate the housing sites in the local plan without really talking about all the infrastructure that's going to be needed to support that as well. So, I mean, our view, and you'll have seen it in our representations, is that the local plan should be looking longer term. It should be looking at least 30 years in line with the NPPF. I think the transitional arrangements that are in the NPPF, I think Tunbridge Wells maybe missed it by about a month or so. So I think it's just a technicality, and I think the principle really stands within the NPPF. They need more time, needs to be more time's required to look at the delivery issues around transport infrastructure, flood risk, wastewater infrastructure, and the phasing of the housing itself, which we really don't feel has been done yet. And just in response to your question number 5 about the Green Belt and or AONB, whether there are reasons for restricting the scale of development. We do think that flood risk is really missing from the conversation at the moment, and the need to undertake a sequential approach to looking at flood risk was never really undertaken by Tunbridge Wells. And that's not, the flood risk isn't just a policy designation such as an AONB or a Green Belt, but it's actually a physical threat, it's a physical issue that's really facing Paddock Wood. So we would like that to feature more in the conversations in the hearings going forward.
Okay, yeah, gentlemen, back. Thank you, sir. Tunbridge Wells Town Hall. We restrict our comment to the town of Royal Tunbridge Wells, and not the entire borough. And certainly we believe that the Green Belt and we do provide good reason for restricting development of the borough as a whole. But also then the borough council decided that that would not be their principal do support quite a large amount of the draft local plan. And so we're really just looking here at the situation in our Tunbridge Wells, where it's probably a matter for the 27th of May here into Green Belt, rather than today, but just very briefly to make the point that if one admits that there is a possibility of taking Green Belt away in and around Lower Tunbridge Wells itself, our contention would be that that is absolutely not necessary during this current period, because we believe that the Borough Council is too timorous in looking at issues of density within the actual limits of the development of Lower Tunbridge Wells, and also at the opportunities for some fairly major residential development in sites which were not put forward in the call for sites, which are sites where there would be the need for master plan for possibly some compulsory purchase, or all matters which would complicate the delivery of the local plan at this moment, but which we felt should be investigated. And we do believe should be very carefully investigated when there is a review of the plan. But I think, as I say, I think we want to return to this on the 27th of May.
Mr. Barney. So I won't go over what we said in that statement. In essence, you know, clearly these designations do have the ability to restrict development, and so as a more nuanced response, and you have to look at those considerations, and certainly in terms of the Green Belt major developments in the AONB against sort of a high bar. I just wanted to deal with the question that Mr. Bond raised in relation to paragraph 177 of the PPF, and just for the purposes of how we consider the major developments for the purposes of the examination. There's been no real representations on it, and indeed you may have seen that Statement of Common Ground with Natural England, and certainly with the support of the High Road AONB unit, supports the approach we've taken to major developments. Because although it says in the MPPF it refers to in relation to planning applications, then we've taken the view that that should apply at the local plan level as well. And logically, it makes sense if a site is to be appropriate at a planning application stage, and indeed we need to be sure about its deliverability at the local plan stage. We've actually taken a view in relation to major developments which hasn't been challenged by Natural England, and that we've included sites which cumulatively would represent major development, but which individually would not. And you'll see that, and we're happy that that is the approach, if you like, the bar that it's tested against for the purposes of the local plan. So I just wanted to just highlight that's the approach that we've taken. You'll have seen that through the documentation, and hopefully that's not in contention.
Okay, thank you. So any other questions, queries, observations on either questions 5 or 6 really? Similar themes there about whether the principle of these designations really would restrict or would result in a lower housing requirement for.
Thank you, sir. It's just one other point in terms of the application of the framework in terms of the AONB. I don't think Mr. Marlowe was disputing the point I made that para 177 could still nevertheless be applied in a plan making way in terms of those tests. But that one, in a similar vein to the Green Belt, confirms that there is a mechanism whereby a plan can still nevertheless allocate land for major development within the AONB. The second point here is that para 176, it does say the scale and extent of development within all of these designated areas, obviously including the AONB, should be limited. And the council's Matter 2 statement did seek to paint the picture that what development is being proposed within the AONB in terms of a total proportion of growth and also the number of residential address points in the borough, etc., is in one sense limited. The AONB, according to Google at least, is 146,170 hectares. The option that my clients are putting to the council to the north of Tunbridge Wells in terms of development is 33 hectares, and that's 0.022% of the AONB as a whole. And if you wanted to apply 176, that would fall within the word limited in the context of the AONB as a whole. And the only reason I make that point, sir, that is because that is the sort of approach the council have adopted in seeking to justify that the current scale of housing growth within the AONB is compared to it as a whole. And I've simply made that similar point in relation to the option to the north of the town. And one must not forget, in a similar vein to Green Belt, it's obviously unfortunate, but it is a characteristic of this borough. You've got the main settlement, the most sustainable settlement, with the majority or a significant proportion of the employment, location of housing need, in terms of both market and affordable housing, being in a town that is tightly defined by an AONB designation. There's nowhere in the framework that says, even in those circumstances, development should not be permitted within the AONB. If anything, it says the opposite. Those are considerations that could amount to, as a matter of planning judgment, to exceptional circumstances that would justify additional development over and above what is currently planned in the plan to meet those important sustainability locations of need, albeit within a mitigated form to moderate, because that is the test, the detrimental effect on the air and the environment. Thank you.
Okay, the gentleman at the back, sorry, I can't read your name, but
on the question of housing and the figures we're working with are best estimates. It's nothing absolute. The best estimates. The council has chosen to go for the 40% cap. I can't comment on whether that's a cap or not, but they've gone to that. Anyway, but it's a target. One of the problems with the plan as it stands is that if a site is allocated, it is put into the built development zone and the protection to the land is gone. And regardless of the uncertainties on that, now the uncertainties of housing which will become available in the borough area, uncertainties about what's the future. And Seven Oaks adopted a policy with one of their sites. So they only proposed 3 sites to be but one of their sites, they adopted the policy of not removing it from the green belt initially, but they put it into a category called broad locations of growth, where it would remain protected until a future plan on the 5-year reviews soon would decide whether it was required to be released or not. And there are certain sites, certainly in Tunbridge Wells Borough, which are dubious, well opposed, but if they were absolutely essential to meet housing needs, people would accept that. So that's not proven at the moment. And And so we're very reluctant to see those sites released for spurious purpose, if that turns out to be the case. And is there not scope for, if there's need to allocate sufficient sites to meet the target figure in the plan, then to use this other category of, say, for locations for growth, so that the removal from the green belt and the removal of protection of that site does not take place now in institution, but can be done in 5 years' time or 10 years' time when the activity absolute need for it is established.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa Skinner, on behalf of Roscom Strategic. We'd just like to comment. Obviously, the council has carried out quite a thorough assessment of the constraints, and that sort of has a sort of a reverse assessment as well, because when they've said they've assessed the Green Belt and the AONB, they've also looked quite carefully at sites that are outside those protective areas. And obviously, my client has an interest in Horse London, which is one of the largest villages. And what they've actually looked at is not just the constraints of that village, but the cumulative impact of what capacity some of these sites that are outside these restrained areas could actually take. And I think that's quite important in terms of a cumulative assessment, because it then feeds in about the impact of deliverability of sites. The NPPF is quite clear about the importance of small, medium sites that can be brought forward quickly. And there are always issues at the large strategic sites quite often being delayed in terms of what can actually happen on the ground, mainly because of the infrastructure needing to go in place. And that was the only comments we wanted to make on that. So.
Okay, thank you. Anything final to want to get us forward was needs? Mr. Neal.
So I'm grateful to be allowed to just raise one final point on this matter. You'll see, in terms of the questions you asked, in terms of the stage at which you consider the housing requirement, so the numerical figure of the housing requirement in light of green belt constraints. I just draw your attention to the letter from the Secretary of State that we've referenced in our position statement at paragraph 27, where I think it encapsulates what we say is the correct position, the correct application of national policy in relation to green belt and the assessment of housing needs and requirements. And there, the Secretary of State has replied to, has made it clear local authorities will need to consider the constraints they face locally, such as green belt, before determining their housing requirement. We've given you the reference to that letter. But we say that particular part of the decision-making process, where you look at the housing requirement in light of those constraints, has not been properly considered by the authority here. And you can see that, and you can see the elision of the process that's taken place in their position statements at 58 to paragraphs 58 to 61, where in relation to this particular question, the authority 58 acknowledges that the constraints posed by the green belt, and says this: the majority of the green belt does provide a strong reason for restricting the scale of development in the borough. Then it moves straight on to 59 and 60 to say, however, some areas where land within the green belt makes a weak contribution to one more green belt. There are, however, some areas where land within the green belt makes a weak contribution to one more green belt purposes. And there are instances where there are exceptional circumstances that justify their removal from the green belt. Now, so far so good, in that seems to be saying, yes, there are some sites that make a weak contribution. So on that basis, we might stick as our standard housing requirement figure. But what you don't see there is a pause for thought and saying, actually, is this housing requirement number that we've alighted upon, should that be adjusted in numerical terms to reflect those constraints? And then you'll see that 60 to 61 immediately going into looking at the strategic sites and the fact that the potential harm acknowledged there is high. That just doesn't make sense. What you don't have is a part of the decision-making process where the authority says, is there justification to lower the housing requirement in light of that analysis of the Green Belt, and as a whole, what sort of contribution land within the Green Belt, within the Borough Authority makes to it. So I just wanted to highlight that part of their position statement where that stage in the decision-making process we say has been jumped over. And that's what I wanted to sort of re-emphasise in my earlier submissions. Thank you, sir.
So just as a final summary on this topic, so do you want to move on to just come back on that very specific point there about the staging and consideration?
Yeah, and the chronology is important. The draft local plan is consulted upon it as a reasonable option. We had a lot of representations at that point, and a lot of issues were raised. And the council then did look at all those, did take stock, and as a result, did further work to inform its decision that it would have to make on exceptional circumstances. That included the Green Belt Stage 3 work, the AONB setting report, and critically, perhaps in terms of the deliverability side, as well as the sustainability, commissioned the master planning, or got underway the master planning work through the strategic sites working group. So all those things were informing in a more robust way the council's decision on exceptional circumstances. And yes, then it did make that decision. You know, if the exceptional circumstance, if the view had been arrived at that, right, taking all things into account, there aren't the exceptional circumstances, then it would have had a decision to have made about whether it met its need. And you know, it may well not have done, I don't know. I personally have taken a plan through which didn't meet its full need, and quite legitimately so, and those are accepted as an examination. But you know, it came to the conclusion that the exceptional circumstances, notwithstanding the harm to the Green Belt, acknowledge that completely. There were exceptional circumstances and mitigations as well that were built into the plan that meant the exceptional circumstances test was met. So that process was, I believe, duly gone through.
I want to move on to spend a bit of time moving to the lunch break on issue 2 around affordable housing. 3 questions there to go through. Question 1 and 2 really was around what is the annual need for affordable housing? So different, just from my sort of notes and scribbles, of different figures referred to. There's a figure in the 2015 SMART student housing market assessment. There was then 2018 housing needs study, and then the 2020 review for the housing. So when the council was obviously preparing the plan, what was the need for the housing, and where was that set out, and what figure was the council working towards? And then as a sort of follow to that question, how has that figure then changed since?
It's actually Justin Gardner. I've got other things, I'll put that one up. Here, as part of teamwork with GR, I prepared the Affordable Needs Assessment 2015. Not involved in a survey-based assessment, you know, from 2018, and then it was my report from early last year that looks again at affordable housing need. So what have you got? And in terms of where the various evidence-based documents sit with plan preparation, that's something perhaps for the council. But in terms of where I am, prepared an assessment 2015 with Geo Hearn, suggesting a need for 340 units per annum. Up for produced a survey-based assessment 3 years later, which shows a slightly higher level of need. And then my more recent work from a year or so ago we're suggesting a need for around 320 units per annum. That's for a need for affordable housing for households who are unable to afford anything in the market, so unable to afford to buy or rent without some degree of subsidy. So the council may be able to answer how it fits in with plan making, but I think from my point of view, in terms of your question, it's clear that assessments are a snapshot in time. Data changes, so in terms of the secondary data assessments that I carried out, data around house prices, private sector rents, incomes, demographics and the rate of household formation, and anything such as the supply of housing that comes through relets of existing social stock will change over time. So I think in that sense, your question about should there be a figure in the plan, the answer is it varies over time. So the plan we shouldn't have a specific figure in it. I think what I will say is that all of those pieces of research do identify that the council should be maximising delivery where opportunities arise, which will be limited by the viability of providing affordable housing. And I think that's what's driven the council's affordable housing policy, which seeks 40% on most sites and 30% on other sites.
We'll sort of get on as the examination continues and into looking at specific sites and what they'll deliver. Just looking at the actual need, I think should it be set out in the plan? Council, see, you said no because things change. Could you not label that to a lot of things in plan making? Housing needs, housing requirements change, retail impact assessments change.
We could
development needs change. I think where I was going with it was the paragraph 20 in the framework talks about student policy setting out an overall strategy for pattern, scale, design policy places, make sufficient provision for housing, including for housing. I think probably looking at effectiveness of the plan. I picked at the plan wasn't sure what the full housing need was.
Certainly wouldn't have any objection to.
I think it does need to say it out somewhere.
Yeah.
As we'll go on to discuss, obviously, it then feeds into the story about why there's justification for certain requirements. So I think the plan probably
so in terms
does
of
need to set it out what the need is.
So in terms of some of the chronology of the work that's been done and how that's then fed into the policy.
Yeah.
I think so. We clearly reference right at the beginning of the plan, affordability is a key issue, the substantial housing needs, and we reference the topic paper for that information, for the detail of that. I think yes, you're right. It is a key factor leading, guiding the affordable housing policies. I think, as has been said, if we can reference the document and the need in that document, then that may be useful context.
Johnson.
Thank you. Mr. Garden just referred to 323 homes per year, which is, as I understand it, affordable, social and rented. It's the rented component only per year. I think it's important that the rest of the report goes on to say that there is equally shared ownership, affordable needs, and other affordable home ownership needs, which I think is an additional 347 homes a year. So if the plan is going to include a figure, I think it needs to be accurate to reflect affordable housing as a whole, not just rented. Clearly there's a need for other forms of tenure.
Let's just come back on.
I'll just quickly deal with that. Yes, so I think that was one of the drivers of me producing this report a year ago, was that government had extended its definition of affordable housing within the NPPF to include forms of affordable home ownership. So this report did look at that. One thing, and I can bring up a reference, but one thing, I think, well, a couple of bits. Firstly, government might have said it wants to look at affordable home ownership. It didn't provide in planning practice guidance any sort of method for looking at the need for it. What we've done is work through on the basis of households that effectively in an income term sit somewhere between rent a home and buy a home, which certainly does identify that there's quite a quite a number of households like to sit in that affordability gap, if you like. However, the report, the February 2021 report, has identified that there is actually also potentially quite a substantial supply of homes within the market priced below a lower quartile. By definition, a quarter of all homes sold must be below a lower quartile. That's actually made it very difficult to establish a need for affordable home ownership. Effectively, if I netted off all homes that are sold below a lower quartile from the existing housing stock, the need for affordable home ownership comes up to something like 25 units a year, which is not significant. But that's not so it's must gone through a process and say, well, actually, there are quite a chunk of houses who sit in that gap between buying and renting, but actually there's potentially supply. Report also highlights further issues around it seems that while house prices are clearly high in Tunbridge Wells, the barrier to entering an occupied market is not just about price. A lot of it's driven by lack of deposits. So again, there's a range of issues to be considered. But I think again, a narrative could be included around that, but I don't think in the same way for affordable and social rented housing that would come to any conclusion about a firm need, because there's a lot of unknowns out there. But
I think it's more to do with the implementation and monitoring of the plan. So there's a policy in the local plan requirement which is affordable housing, which isn't just affordable rented, clearly, and that is because it needs to meet a wide range of needs, which spans beyond rented. So when you come to look at the monitoring and implementation side of that kind of policy, it is useful to see what benchmark you're seeking to attain. So is the council making inroads to reducing its need for both affordable rented and for home ownership? So I agree, I think there does need to be a figure in there, certainly from the public's point of view, when they're saying how are we doing in an annual monitoring report that's produced by the council every year. One of the indicators will be how are we doing on delivery of affordable housing. That will span not just rented, it will be shared ownership. So I think that's important. Yeah.
Probably because it's the wording and how it's set out, it's just maybe mistake.
General again.
When Tunbridge Wells comes forward, we very strongly support the endeavours in the local plan, draft local plan, to increase the provision of affordable housing, affordable and social rented housing. We do have concerns as to whether that will actually be achieved in the housing market.
Which sort of ties into the question 3 really. So we talked about this need figure there, and move this forward. How does that then compare to the housing requirements? And ultimately, based on the requirements and thresholds in the plan, which is also will affordable housing needs be met? What's the need? Ultimately, will these needs then be met by the plan?
I'll deal with that.
Yeah.
I think the best place to go in looking at that would probably be in February. Sorry, I haven't got a core document number. The review of affordable housing need in context of first homes, the report from February 2021, from paragraph 3.35 on page 21, which discusses this relationship between affordable need and overall need. And I think it's just really to make the simple point that the link between affordable need and overall need is complex. A lot of the households who get picked up in the modelling of affordable housing needs are already living in some form of accommodation. It's just not suitable for some way, whether it's too expensive, they're not able to get sufficient benefit support or overcrowded. So it's a home that could be available for another household if they were to move to alternative accommodation. That section also recognises that a lot of, over the longer term, over a sort of planned period, a lot of the affordable need comes from new houses forming into the market, which will be what might previously have called concealed households, or newly forming households will often be, for example, grown up grown-up children moving out of parental homes. Such households should already be captured within demographic projections, and of course, with the standard method applying affordability uplifts, you are seeking to boost housing to a level quite a way above the actual need from just demographic growth. So it's providing additional opportunities for those households to form. We also recognise the role that the private rental sector plays through housing benefit. Whilst ideally households would have options for secure social rented housing, secure tenancy with lower rents, that perhaps would encourage staying in or going back to work. The reality is that there is a supply of housing within that private rental sector, again, that is within the stock, and so is not a need for additional housing. So I think, it's if you've got a few moments, do read from paragraph 3.35 of that report onwards. But I think this difficulty was, will affordable housing need to be met? I think the chances are at the end of the plan period, if you did another affordable needs study, you'd still find households who have an affordable need. The question really is, does it have an impact on the overall need for housing? I think the answer there is certainly no. There is sufficient housing stock. Tunbridge Wells does have, has some homelessness issues which by and large are not directly related to housing, but that's apart from through the pandemic we saw some increase. Effectively, the provision of affordable housing is not seeing people queuing at the council doors every morning by many hundreds of thousands more because we're not providing affordable housing, because the market is providing solutions. And I think the role for the council here, by setting the affordable housing policy, is to, as I said, to maximise the delivery on the back of particularly market-led schemes.
I think this goes back to the council's hearing statement there, where it talks about this the need as a percentage or portion of the overall housing requirement. And I think the council in summary said that, sort of pure mathematical sense, when you look at those figures and bear in mind that not all sites can fall by, the full levels of affordable housing will, windfalls will fall under thresholds, etc. That potentially no, not the full 323 affordable homes per year on average will be built. So with that in mind, what did the council then do? Sort of knowing that situation, what did you do? Have you considered upping the housing requirement, building more housing, therefore building more affordable housing? Have you looked at increasing the 40% threshold, 30% threshold? When you had an understanding of potentially not going to meet that thing, what did you do in response to it?
Yes, I think all of those things, and just for yes, it's as you say, paragraph 13 of our response suggests a product of around 225 affordable dwellings a year, excluding one of the provisions we have made, difficult to estimate, is lowering the threshold in AONBs. So yes, as we've already discussed, we've looked at high levels of housing provision, and one of the benefits of those was in relation to delivery of affordable housing. We've also looked at the requirement of new developments. The current core strategy requirement is 35% across the board. We commissioned viability advice, which came back that for greenfield sites, that could be increased across the borough to 40%, not more, 40%. But we were actually perhaps asking a bit in more than could be deliverable on brownfield sites. And in order to ensure the delivery of brownfield sites as part of the strategy, the response was to reduce that to 30%, but to increase the requirement on greenfield sites to 40%, which gave a net overall increase in the yield from affordable of affordable dwellings. There is also the provisions I've just mentioned in NPPF to look at lower thresholds in the AONB, which makes sense because, as we've already agreed, that development should be more limited. So we looked at that, and we set that out in a statement to look at a lower threshold, whereby we will gain financial contributions in all probability towards affordable housing in the rural areas. That's made with the advent of first homes change, because they're mainly more likely to get some on site anyway, but that will be a discussion down the road. So we've done those things essentially to maximise delivery of affordable homes.
So based on the 40% then is derived from viability. So
yes.
Even if you sort of start saying, well, let's look at pure sort of numbers, and you go, okay, well, we need, half of these dwellings to be affordable. You can't start going imposing 50% requirements, even on the greenfield site, because then it's
and I think that's been fairly widely found to be the case as well. Our viability seems to align with others as well, but that is in our published viability advice.
Yeah, we'll start at the top and work our way.
Thank you, sir. The short answer to the question is no. The plan won't meet the affordable housing needs. The reasons for that, I think we need to just explore some of the points that have been raised by the council. Firstly, we've already established that the 323 dwellings per annum need is only part of the picture. It doesn't cover the intermediate requirements. So there is an element there of additional affordable housing need not quantified. Secondly, the 323 alone equates to 50% of the capped standard method figure of 678, which mathematically alone can't be met by a policy which seeks either 40 or 30% provision. Thirdly, sir, that policy, of course, has a tenure split within it. It's a 60-40 tenure split, policy H3 proposes. So 60% would be towards that 323 dwellings per annum, 40% intermediate to deal with the as yet undefined need. So that the level of provision in the circumstances where sites trigger 30% or 40% on-site provision is reduced even further, because only 60% of that 30% and 40% would go towards meeting that 323 dwellings per annum. Then the range of factors which the council themselves identify in terms of scheme viability and certain other delivery restrictions. So to my mind, it is very clear that that figure won't be met, and that realistically the only way of assisting that is to look at pushing back towards an uncapped housing requirement figure, thereby increasing the capability to deliver. Just one final point on the factor about people queuing up at the council offices for housing or not, as the case may be. The council's own evidence there identifies a housing register which is significant. It identifies 950 odd households. 925, sorry, not 950, I've overread it. The topic paper, so this is the housing needs topic paper, so also confirms that that's been a reasonable constant, so it's not a spike in need. So whilst it's a snapshot in time, so you can see that actually, at least on paper, there is a very long queue. And that is a queue of people that are the most vulnerable in society and those in the most need.
I think I know the answer to this question, but from your position then, in terms of, okay, we know the numbers, and that's what you said, in pure mathematical terms, it's not going to meet those numbers. council's position is that they will consider upping housing, but didn't pursue that for whatever reasons. Won't delve too much into that because we've sort of rehearsed those already, especially on the SA. So in terms of sort of the question for me to you, and I imagine other people down this side of the room, to sort of, okay, well, the what next question, because we talked about this morning earlier about an early review, or earlier than early review, which somebody said quite like that, an earlier than early review, or whether or not the plan should actually, through the examination, which is the only avenue available to it, to actually then go and seek to meet these things. So what would you suggest that the plan should do? Because presumably you've got the option there of an early review, or actually essentially pausing an examination to require a council to go away, do more evidence gathering, site searching, essay work, consultation, more hearings, mail engagement, etc., etc. So what do you think the plan should do? I should recommend.
To me, so the answer to that is quite clear. I'm sure colleagues all the way down this side of the table and around that side of the table will also have their own views. But and it's been said this morning around the table as well that we should be seeking to get the best plan out of this process. We should be seeking to do the best that we can to meet the needs, and particularly in the context of this discussion, the needs of the most vulnerable members of society. To my mind, Sarah, it's a small price to pay to go through that process of modification. The evidence is already here, and we'll go on to that in due course in other sessions about the availability of sites, the capability to deliver additional housing within the spatial strategy that the council is looking to pursue. We should be doing that now. We should be looking at a housing figure that is uncapped, which would in turn assist in the delivery of further affordable housing, rather than pushing that, kicking that can down the road to a review.
Just following on from that, really. I know you don't want to go back to the SA particularly, but I mean, the option for the uncapped, addressing the uncapped need, could be quite easily reviewed in the context of what is in the SHLAR and the other sites being implemented. And I think quite quickly the council could come to a position where they could actually identify whether they can provide more housing that potentially addresses this issue of affordability. Going back to what was said earlier on this morning, the position is getting worse. And to leave it for an earlier than early review, I think really, when we are where we are now, we should grasp the nettle, deal with it now, but at the same time deal with it quickly. We need to deal with it expeditiously, because at the same time we need allocated sites so we can actually move forward. But as I say, I think the evidence is there, and it shouldn't really take them that long to go through it.
So I agree with what the colleagues have just said, but my point was really more of a technical matter with regards to said about the unmet need, the need for affordable housing and the churn within that market. And I may be wrong, but my understanding is that the 323 is based on a net need, not a gross need. So that will take into account the relets and the churn within that market to ensure those moving forward. So in terms of the gross need for affordable housing, which is in paragraph 2 of the council's hearing statement, to suggest that, paragraph 3, sorry, the gross need of 503 homes with a relet supply of 180 homes being netted off. So it's whether that would apply. Well, that's my understanding. So.
Thank you, sir. Sort of part in response to the question you posed, what should the plan do? And I should caveat this, I wasn't anticipating speaking in this matter, but the viability exercise suggested that a level of 40% across the borough was achievable. What about a more nuanced approach where clearly Tunbridge Wells, the town, has the highest level of housing need, highest concentration, no doubt, of affordable need, and it also, and presumably, one of the highest land values. And so long as a affordable housing policy, which will be consistent with the framework anyway, is subject to a viability exercise, there should be nothing precluding the plan seeking a higher aspirational level of affordable housing in the right location. And if it proves that that's not viable, then clearly that matter will be addressed at that stage. But at least the bar then is being set at a higher level. Because frankly, I'm somewhat shocked that when you do look at the aggregated total of affordable housing needs, that almost matches the total housing requirement the council is currently planning for. And in that sense, one, if that's not an acceptable circumstance, I don't know what it is. But quite clearly, affordable housing need, and as Mr. Marlowe was quite eloquently highlighting a second or so ago, affordable housing need is so important, it's one of the great priorities of this council, and rightly so, then the plan should seek to address that in a far more positive and proactive and in the right location way. And then the last point is that when we hear, well, why can't we just get the plan adopted and commence a hopefully an early review? You've already heard from the council officers, let alone the members, snippets today that we don't believe there's a need for an early review. And if that's ingrained in the DNA, you've got no chance. Obviously, I've been doing this far too long, but the most effective way to cut through all the local politics, because unfortunately planning is heavily influenced by politics, you've got clear guidance in the framework and the PPG that enables you to do certain things which is entirely consistent with policy, and an amendment through main modifications, effectively a direction from, with greatest respect to yourself, cuts through the politics and the delay, which will inevitably arise if the council were to embark on a local plan review. So the most effective and positive way is to address the issues today through main modifications. And if that results in a slight delay, that is a delay that is much better than a review. Thank you.
Sorry, Greg. Got 2 points to make. Firstly, in terms of the suggestion that one should go back to the uncapped needs to try to boost the level of affordable housing provision. The observation we make is we're not sure it's going to get even close to that. That in itself is a justification. It doesn't even get close to meeting the affordable housing needs. So I'm not sure that in itself provides a justification to go to that uncapped, to adopt that uncapped approach. But the point I wanted to make in terms of affordable housing, second point, is the point we've made in our position statement, which really refers to the approach taken in the strategic sites policies, and the fact there that there is a cross-reference in the strategic site policy to policy H3, so the main affordable housing policy in H3, and the question you've asked is, will affordable housing need to be met? Well, given that because of that cross-reference to policy H3, which allows for exceptional circumstances to be demonstrated, given that that's now baked in, well, as the council are proposing, is baked into the strategic sites policy, Save Caper is concerned that will give the strategic site developers a significant get out in circumstances where the viability of those strategic sites should have been sorted out at the plan making stage. And you can see that quite clearly in in the PPG on viability, paragraph 5, which refers to strategic sites being assessed for viability at the plan making stage. So our point is that there's no justification to include that exceptional circumstances in relation to those strategic sites policies. And if it is included, there is a severe risk that, having put all its eggs in these strategic sites basket, that exceptional circumstance test will be applied to avoid meeting the 40% affordable housing target. And we'd like an explanation from the council as to why it is baked in that test into the strategic sites policy.
So actually, in terms of this, the questions here today around will affordable housing needs be met, and even really going back to before the break around even around some of the Green Belt exceptional circumstances we want to discuss as we go through. It may be that the answer to that question isn't really known until we get to the end of this process, and actually we've looked at the deliverability of the strategic sites in particular. We've looked at whether some of these housing allocations are justified. So it may be one that so we can speculate on numbers now and what will be delivered, etc. But maybe that should start to unpick some of the strategic sites in particular. To be coming back to some of these issues. We'll come down this side table and we'll end with the council, then we'll break for lunch. Sorry, can't see who's got the name by the gentleman with the glasses. Yeah.
David Murray Cox, attorney. I don't really know if I need to make this point now because you sort of said it yourself. So I might just go on and say it, if that's okay. There are 2 points related but hopefully distinct. The first is this a plan which is capable of meeting affordable housing needs early in the plan period? Because as you rightly pointed out, we have strategic sites to consider, and fundamentally it's presumably reasonable to assume that within the council's evidence there are people in need of affordable housing now and in the next 5 years. The second point is that whether or not the plan achieves those needs over the plan period. And obviously we come on, I think, at the end of June or sometime to talk about whether or not this plan achieves the housing requirement. And we'll talk about phasing, build out rates and deliverability and so on. And from our side and others I know as well, there are compelling reasons as to why we think the council's expectations are extremely optimistic. Any downward changes to the trajectory for those sites clearly has a knock-on effect as to whether or not this plan achieves those affordable housing requirements over the plan period, yet let alone early.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Just to put a, I suppose, a numerical response to your question. To my mind, there's a view here that this plan should provide a 20% buffer. It currently provides an 8.6% buffer onto its capped need figure. Now, you might ask why 20%. You only need to look at recent examples in Mid-Sussex and in Guildford. And they were dealt with under a 2012 NPPF context, but in those two scenarios, there were certain market signals in terms of affordable housing need. The inspectors of both those local plans considered there was sufficient evidence to include a 20% buffer onto those plans. So we would call for a similar exercise here, sir.
Okay, finish the council. Any point you'd like to come back on, please?
I won't deal with the buffer question, so unless you specifically want us to. I think viability, the point was made about viability. Viability is always an issue. There is a requirement. Obviously, you have to provide some flexibility, and that has to be done, and we obviously do that. Equally, affordable need is, my experience is always an issue for local plans. The affordable housing need is very difficult to actually numerically meet. There's no actual requirement to do. What you've got to do is your best, really, with what you can do. And I feel that's what the council is doing. And I think by increasing the delivery of affordable housing, which will happen through this plan quite substantially, we will address the sort of the waiting list, those nomination rights. I'm confident that that will come down as a result of what we're doing. It was suggested that there'd be variable rates. Just to be clear, when I say across the borough, I mean for all parts of the borough. Indeed, even in Tunbridge Wells, you may be able to get a 50% rate and sort of close to the pantiles, but basically the sites we're looking at won't be an awful lot different from the fringes of the rural, mostly AONB settlements. So our evidence is that 40% is deliverable, and hence we're able confidently to make that requirement. We do feel that is as far as we can reasonably go without going down to a site-by-site viability. So I think that's where we're at, and we are, as I say, doing what we can as a council to meet the affordable housing needs, and indeed in prioritising those in greatest need.
Okay, any other final points from Mr. Bond?
Thank you, sir. Just a semi-procedural. And I sense you've deliberately skipped question 4 about the minimum 15-year plan period from adoption. Could I be spared 60 seconds on that, if I may, sir? Thank you. The requirement in the framework is clear. It's a 15-year period from adoption. The local development scheme assumed adoption in 2023, January 2023. Clearly, that is not going to occur, as the council accept in their matter 2 statement, paragraph 49. The likelihood is, despite the council saying, oh, it might now be adopted in March next year, my view, sir, and obviously you will be best placed because you're in part influencing that process, is it will be adopted post March next year, and that would then trigger, consistent with Power 22, an additional year being added to the plan with an additional requirement of additional 678 or 741 dwellings, to ensure that the plan is then consistent with the framework in respect of that paragraph. Now, a number of other inspectors have found that an important requirement. Clearly, it's raised, as you have raised it, within the matters, issues and questions, and one would invite you to adopt that approach. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One thing I just will say, I know that Mr. Jones in particular, you made some detailed representations about housing needs, especially in the sort of context of meeting housing needs for old people. We've not touched on that today, but I think that's probably a matter 8 topic where we've got a bit more time to sort of unpick those quite specific issues. So yeah, wasn't ignoring the representations or hearing statements, clearly take those into account. I think just in terms of actually having that debate, it probably falls neatly into matter 8 off the top of my head.
So if I can say that's kind of what we anticipated in terms of the hearing, where we just, because it does technically come, obviously more than technically comes within it, but that's why we haven't been raising them. We take it, as you said, you've got them on board and we can develop any more points on matter 8. But I'm grateful for that clarification. That's what we've been assuming, so thank you.
Very good. Anything else?
So did you want us to come back on the plan period, or are you happy?
Okay, the next session is due to start 2 p.m. I think everybody who's attending that session is here already, I think. You nodding heads, yeah. Is 40 minutes enough time for people? Is that about, yeah, still happy to start at 2 o'clock for those attending this afternoon? Yeah, is that okay for the council? Try and stick to 2 p.m. Yeah. Happy to stay longer if you need longer for various things you need to do. Okay, we'll do it today. We'll resume by 2 p.m.